The sun rose not with a triumphant blaze, but with a weary, blood-orange sigh, spilling a pale and sickly light over the great city of Tenochtitlan. Titlan High Priest Itzli stood on the highest platform of the Templo Mayor, his aged hands gripping the cold stone parapet. His heart a cold, heavy stone in his own chest. Each dawn for the past cycle had been like this, the great god Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, struggling to haul his burning disk into the sky, his strength visibly waning. The light that fell upon the gleaming white temples and the bustling canals below was thin, washed out, a faded copy of the fierce, life-giving radiance that had once defined the world. Itzli's keen eyes, trained over decades to read the subtle language of the heavens, saw the truth the common people below only felt as a vague unease. The sun was hungry. It was a colossal celestial being that demanded sustenance, and that sustenance was Cuauhtli, precious water, the sacred liquid of life. But the gods did not drink from clay jars or canals. They drank the most potent essence of life itself. The blood that coursed through human veins, the still-beating hearts that housed the very spark of existence. This weakening dawn was not a natural phenomenon. It was a divine complaint, a warning rumble from a starved deity. A deep familiar dread coiled in Itzli's stomach. The balance of the cosmos was a fragile, bloody thing, maintained only through a constant willing exchange. The sun gave life to the corn, the beans, the people. In return, the people had to give life back to the sun. To fail in this duty was to invite cataclysm. The world would grow cold, the crops would fail, and the endless night would descend. Populated by the star demons of the north, the Titsimum, who waited hungrily in the darkness for just such a failure. He watched the sluggish movement in the sacred precinct below. Priests in black robes moved with a purpose that bordered on panic, their steps a little too quick, their whispers a little too sharp. The air itself felt thin, charged with a desperate anxiety. The recent victories in the flower wars had provided captives, bodies, to feed the divine machinery, but Itzli feared it was not enough. The sun's hunger seemed deeper, more insatiable than before. It demanded not just quantity, but quality. A common prisoner's life force might stave off the darkness for a day, but only the sacrifice of a truly honored, pure, and willing soul, a warrior of renown, a lord of flawless youth, could truly strengthen the sun's weakened limbs and restore his golden vigor. The fate of everything, the towering pyramids, the floating gardens, the laughing children in the streets, rested on this brutal, beautiful equation. As the anemic sunlight finally cleared the distant mountains, Itzli turned from the view, his mind already turning to the grim logistics of appeasement. The gods had spoken through the pallid sky. The price for another day of life would be paid in blood. The acrid scent of sweat, smoke, and victory still clung to Cuautli's skin as he stood at rigid attention in the great courtyard of the Eagle Knights. His limbs ached with the sweet fatigue of battle, his shield arm heavy. The obsidian-edged Cuauhtli notched and stained with the proof of his valor. Only hours before he had fought in the ritual flower war against the Tlaxcalans, the air thick with the thud of wooden weapons and the grunts of striving men. He had fought not to kill, but to capture, and he had succeeded, dragging two strong-limbed warriors back across the field as his prizes. The approving nods from his commanders had filled his chest with a fire warmer than any sun. Now that fire was banked, replaced by a cold, humming stillness. The high priest Itzli moved before the ranks of returned warriors, his black robes whispering against the stone flags, his face an impassive mask of carved obsidian. His eyes, ancient and knowing, scanned each young man, weighing not just muscle and skill, but something deeper, the quality of the spirit within. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken significance. This was no mere mustering of troops. This was a selection. Itzli paused before Cuauhtli. The priest's gaze was a physical weight, pressing down on him, seeming to peel back the layers of his being to examine the soul beneath. Cuauhtli held his breath, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He saw something flicker in the priest's dark eyes, a spark of recognition, of grim satisfaction. A long, bony finger, adorned with a ring of jade, extended and pointed directly at his chest. A collective sharp intake of breath rustled through the courtyard. The greatest honor, the highest destiny a warrior could aspire to, had been bestowed. Cuauhtli was to be Ixiptla, the god's impersonator, the chosen sacrifice. His strong blood, his proven courage, his unblemished youth, these were the qualities the hungry son required. His life would not end in a forgotten field or a sickbed, but in a blaze of glory on the summit of the world. His heart offered directly to Huitzilopochtli to fuel the sun's journey across the sky. A dizzying wave of pride washed over him, so potent it made his knees weak. He had been found worthy. The news traveled to his family's simple dwelling, on the edge of the city with the speed of a hummingbird's wing. His mother, who had been grinding maize, let the stone mano fall from her hands, the crack of it on the floor echoing her shattered composure. Her face, which had glowed with relief at his safe return, crumpled. A low guttural moan escaped her lips, a sound of primal loss. Before she clamped a hand over her mouth, smothering the grief that was an insult to the honor being bestowed. Tears tracked clean lines through the dust on her cheeks, a silent testament to a love that warred with duty. His father stood straighter, his own warrior's scars seeming to deepen on his proud face. He placed a firm, calloused hand on his wife's trembling shoulder, his grip both comfort and command. In his eyes a complex storm raged, the fierce joy of a father whose son had achieved the ultimate glory, layered over the bottomless sorrow of a man who would soon lose his child. He looked at Cuauhtli and gave a single slow nod. It was a gesture of acceptance, of reverence, of a pain so immense it could only be expressed in silence. The household, once filled with the joyful anticipation of his return, was now a place of sacred tension, torn violently between the soaring heights of divine pride and the crushing depths of human grief. The sacred precinct swallowed Cuauhtli whole, its stone walls rising like the sides of a canyon, shutting out the world of his family, his home, his former life. The heavy wooden door of the purification house closed behind him with a soft, final thud, sealing him in a space that smelled of copal smoke, dried herbs, and cold, still water. Here the sounds of the city, the chatter of merchants, the laughter of children, the rhythm of daily life were muted to a distant hum, replaced by the solemn silence of ritual. He was no longer merely Cuauhtli, the victorious eagle knight. He was a vessel being prepared for a divine purpose, his humanity slowly being scoured away to make room for the god. The rituals began at once. Elder priests, their faces serene and their movements economical, guided him through acts of cleansing that were as much spiritual as physical. They stripped him of his battle gear and his simple cotton clothes, symbols of his earthly identity. Then they anointed his skin with water drawn from a sacred cenote, each drop cool and heavy with ancient power. They rubbed his limbs with fine white clay until he gleamed like a marble statue in the dim light, a blank slate upon which destiny would be written. The clay dried tight on his skin, a second, purer skin that marked his separation from the dust of the ordinary world. For days, he ate only sparingly small portions of amaranth cakes and sips of water, enough to sustain the body, but not enough to distract the spirit. His senses sharpened in the deprivation. The flicker of a torch flame became a miniature sun, the scent of burning copal, a direct pathway to the heavens. He spent hours in silent meditation, cross-legged on a mat of woven reeds, learning to still the frantic beating of his own heart, to quiet the human fears that whispered at the edges of his consciousness. The priests taught him to visualize his spirit separating from his flesh, to see his body not as a prison, but as a temporary offering, a beautifully wrapped gift soon to be presented. Then came the songs. An ancient wrinkled priest, his voice a dry rasp that nonetheless held the echoes of countless ceremonies, began the instruction. The melodies were complex, weaving through strange haunting scales that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the air. The words were in the old formal tongue, each syllable a key that unlocked a different aspect of the sacred journey. They were songs of greeting for the sun god, hymns of gratitude for the life that had been given and was now to be returned, chants to strengthen his own spirit for the final glorious ascent. Cuauhtli practiced them until his throat was raw, repeating the phrases until they were etched into his memory deeper than any childhood rhyme. He sang them in the stillness of his cell, his voice a low, steady thread in the silence. He came to understand that these were not merely songs to be performed. They were a map, a guide for his soul to navigate the liminal space between the mortal world and the divine. As he mastered each verse, a profound calm settled over him. The pride that had first filled him was tempered now into a serene and absolute acceptance. He was the chosen note in a cosmic hymn, and he would sing his part perfectly. The great drum of Huitzilopochtli began its slow, resonant beat, a sound that seemed to rise from the very stones of Tenochtitlan. It was a call that could not be ignored, a summons that vibrated in the chest of every listener. Pulling them from their homes and into the wide ceremonial avenue that led to the Templo Mayor, the procession was beginning. Cuauhtli emerged from the purification house, and the world erupted in a blaze of color and sound. He was no longer a man clad in white clay, but a living icon, a vision of sacred splendor. His body was painted with intricate patterns of deep blue and brilliant red, symbols of the sky and the lifeblood he would soon offer. A magnificent headdress of iridescent green quetzal feathers cascaded down his back, each plume catching the thin morning light and shimmering with an otherworldly glow. A heavy collar of gold and jade weighed upon his chest, and his wrists were circled with cuffs of polished obsidian. He was a walking treasure, a masterpiece of ritual art, every inch of him proclaiming his honored status. The crowds that lined the processional way were a living, breathing entity, a river of humanity that surged against the cordons held by eagle and jaguar warriors. Their faces were upturned, a mosaic of awe, reverence, and a raw, hungry need. They saw in him not a young man marching to his death, but their own hope for survival given glorious form. As he took his first step onto the stone-paved avenue, a great roar went up, a wave of sound that washed over him. Hands reached out not to touch him, but to brush the air around him, to capture some fleeting fragment of the sacred power he carried. Flowers rained down from rooftops and balconies, their bright petals carpeting his path in a fragrant, ephemeral tribute. He began the long, slow climb. The temple pyramid loomed ahead, its twin sanctuaries to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaca, a stark silhouette against the pale sky. The steps were steep, countless, a staircase to the heavens themselves. With each measured pace he took, the drumbeat seemed to synchronize with the pounding of his own heart. The chants of the accompanying priests wove around the drum's rhythm, their voices a hypnotic drone that guided his feet and stilled his mind. He focused on the song he had learned, its words a silent mantra on his lips, a thread of purpose leading him upward. The higher he climbed, the more the city unfolded below him, a breathtaking panorama of canals, causeways, and whitewashed buildings, all teeming with the life his sacrifice was meant to preserve. The noise of the crowd began to soften, transforming from a chaotic roar into a unified, distant hum, like the sound of the sea. The air grew thinner, cooler, smelling less of the masses and more of the copal smoke that poured from the braziers at the summit. He was leaving the world of men behind, ascending into the realm of the gods. His breath came in steady clouds, his adorned body moving with a grace that felt both his own and not his own. Each step, a deliberate, sacred act in the great and terrible drama of renewal. High Priest Itzli stood alone in the dim, smoke-heavy chamber behind the temple sanctuary. The roar of the crowd below was a distant ocean, its waves breaking against the stone foundations of the pyramid, a constant reminder of the multitude whose fate now rested in his aged, steady hands. Before him, on a low altar of polished basalt, lay the sacred blade. The tekpatl, an obsidian knife, gleamed with a dark liquid light, its edges impossibly sharp, its form a lethal curve of volcanic glass. It was more than a tool. It was a sliver of night, a fragment of divine intention given form, waiting to perform its holy duty. Itzli's hands, veined and weathered by decades of service, moved with a practiced, reverent precision. He took a smooth river stone and a leather strop, his movements slow and ritualistic. He did not need to sharpen the blade its edge. Freshly knapped by the temple's master craftsman, was already finer than any metal could achieve. This was not a practical act, but a meditative one. Each long, smooth stroke of stone against glass was a prayer, a physical mantra that focused his will and sanctified the instrument. The soft, whispering scrape was the only sound in the chamber, a counterpoint to the thrum of the expectant city below. His lips began to move, forming the ancient words of the invocation to Huitzilopochtli. The chant was a low, guttural stream of power, each syllable a thread woven into the fabric of the moment. He called upon the hummingbird of the south to witness the preparation, to lend his fierce strength to the arm that would wield the blade, to open his celestial maw to receive the precious offering. He praised the sun's terrible hunger and thanked it for the life it gave, affirming the necessity of the brutal exchange about to take place. The words were not requests. They were affirmations of a cosmic contract, repeated for the 10,000th time, their power built upon the blood of countless chosen ones before. As he chanted, his mind turned inward, shedding the concerns of the mortal world. The weight of his years, the quiet doubts that sometimes flickered in the deep watches of the night, the personal ache of sending so many bright, willing souls into the dark, all of it was compartmentalized, locked away in a deep chamber of his spirit. He could not afford empathy, not here, not now. His role was not that of a man, but of a conduit. He was the hinge upon which the universe turned in this moment, the point of contact between the desperate need of humanity and the insatiable demand of the divine. He saw not the young warrior Cuauhtli, with his proud bearing and learned songs, but the life force that pulsed within him, the tonality, the animating spirit that was the only sustenance potent enough to stave off the eternal night. Cuautli's consciousness expanded, reaching beyond the stone walls, feeling the weakening sun straining against the fabric of the sky. He felt its hunger as a physical pull, a vacuum that demanded to be filled. His own heartbeat slowed, his breath deepened. His entire being became a single focused point of intent. The swift, clean cut, the offered heart, the spilled blood that would become the sun's strength, the world's continued breath. The chanting ceased. The chamber was utterly silent. He picked up the tekpedal. It was an extension of his own will, cold and perfect and ready. The priest was gone. Only the instrument of the god remained. The first step onto the pyramid's stone flank was a crossing of an invisible threshold, a leaving behind of the world of men for the realm where only gods and offerings dared to tread. The roar of the crowd below softened, muffled by the sheer scale of the structure and the sacred weight of the air. Cuauhtli's bare feet, painted with the symbols of his journey, met the cold, steeply angled stone. Each step was a deliberate act of will, a physical prayer that carried him further from the earthly and closer to the eternal. The feathered headdress, once a glorious weight, now felt like a crown of air, each quetzal plume seeming to strain upward, pulling him toward the summit where the smoke of the sacred braziers coiled into the pale sky. The weight he felt was no longer just the physical burden of his ritual adornments. It was the collective expectation of the entire world below. Could feel it pressing down on his shoulders, a tangible force woven from the hopes, fears, and desperate faith of every man, woman, and child, whose eyes were turned toward his ascent. He was their single, fragile thread of connection to the divine, their sole conduit for the plea to keep the sun burning, the rains falling, the world turning. It was a crushing responsibility, and for a moment his breath hitched, the sheer magnitude of it threatening to buckle his knees. But as he climbed, a strange shift occurred. The crushing weight began to transform, to sublimate from a pressure into a presence. He was not alone on the stairs. The air around him grew thick, humming with an energy that was not of the mortal plane. He felt a vast awareness settle upon him, ancient and immense and utterly focused. It was the gaze of Huitzilopochtli. The god was watching his approach. His divine attention, a palpable force that filled the space between the stones, that vibrated in the very sunlight struggling through the haze. It was not a scrutiny of judgment, but one of anticipation, of a hunger so profound it bordered on affection. The god was waiting for the gift, and in his waiting, he acknowledged the giver. Cuauhtli's fear dissolved, replaced by a serene and absolute certainty. His own individual will began to ebb, merging with the grand, terrible purpose of the ritual. His steps, which had been his own, now felt guided, each placement perfect and preordained. The sacred songs he had learned in the quiet of his cell now rose unbidden in his mind, their melodies threading. Through his consciousness, a golden cord tethering his soul to the destiny that awaited him at the apex of the world. He was no longer a man climbing a pyramid. It was a prayer being spoken, a note in a cosmic hymn, ascending to meet the ear of the god himself. The city below faded into an impressionistic tapestry of life, and all that existed was the next step, the next breath, and the overwhelming divine presence that drew him ever upward. The air thinned further with every step. Each breath, a conscious effort that filled his lungs with the cold, sacred smoke from the braziers above. The roar of the crowd was now a distant, unified hum, the sound of a single great beast watching from below, its hopes and fears merged into one resonant note. Cuauhtli paused, his body trembling not from exhaustion, but from the sheer intensity of the moment, and he turned his gaze from the steep stairs ahead to the world spread out beneath him. Tenochtitlan unfolded like a living map crafted by the gods themselves. The canals were threads of shimmering silver, stitching together neighborhoods of whitewashed adobe and thatch. The great causeways reached out like stone arms, connecting the island city to the distant shores of the lake. He could see the bustling activity of the marketplace at Tlatelolco, a vibrant mosaic of color and movement, and the quiet, ordered geometry of the floating chinampas, heavy with crops. From this impossible height, every aspect of human life, the fishermen in their canoes, the women weaving on rooftops, the children chasing dogs in the plazas, seemed small, precious, and achingly fragile. This was the world his sacrifice would preserve. This teeming, beautiful, brutal city was the reason for the blood that would soon be spilled. A profound and final acceptance settled over him, as calm and deep as the lake surrounding the city. The last vestiges of his individual self. The young warrior named Cuauhtli, with his personal memories and dreams, dissolved into the vastness of the purpose before him. He was no longer a son, a brother, or an eagle knight. He was a vital pulse in the heart of the cosmos, a necessary exchange in the eternal cycle of life and death. The sun needed strength to rise, the earth needed rain to bear fruit, and the people needed the gods to be fed. His own life was the currency for this transaction. He offered it not with regret, but with a fierce, overflowing gratitude for the honor of being chosen. He understood now that his death was not an end, but a transformation. His blood would water the roots of the world tree. His breath would become the wind that filled the sails of the sunboat. His heart would fuel the great engine of the universe for another turn. He was joining the endless sacred dance of creation and destruction, of giving and taking, that had pulsed since the dawn of time. A deep, resonant peace flooded his being, washing away the last traces of fear. He turned his face back toward the summit, where the priests waited in their feathered regalia, their forms dark against the sky. The final steps awaited, the last few breaths of a mortal life. He took them with a steady, unwavering grace, his spirit already singing the song of the sun, ready to become one with the light he was dying to save. The final step brought him onto the flat, blood-darkened stone of the summit. The world fell away, replaced by a dizzying expanse of sky. And the distant, muted roar of the city below, now a mere whisper against the thunderous incantations of the priests. 4 of them, their faces obscured by masks of jade and turquoise mosaic, moved with a chilling synchronicity. Their hands, strong and impersonal, guided Cuauhtli not with force, but with an inexorable, ritual certainty. He did not resist. His body, still humming with the peace of his ascent, was pliant as they laid him back upon the cold, convex surface of the great sacrificial stone. The carved stone met his spine, a familiar and expected chill that seeped through the elaborate body paint. His head rested in the specially designed cupped depression, holding him in place, presenting his chest to the heavens. His arms and legs were grasped, not brutally, but firmly, extended and held fast by the attending priests. The position was one of offering, of vulnerability and supreme power simultaneously. He was pinned not as a prisoner, but as a precious object being presented for divine inspection. Above him, the sky was a pale, endless bowl, the weakened sun, a blurred eye, watching from its zenith. The roar of the crowd and the rhythmic chanting of the priests began to merge into a single, overwhelming soundscape, a great primal hymn of need and devotion. The deep-throated boom of the Cuauhtli drum vibrated through the stone altar and into Cuautli's very bones, a heartbeat that was both his own and that of the world. The priests' voices rose and fell in complex, ululating patterns, their words ancient and potent, calling directly upon Huitzilopochtli to descend, to witness, to partake. The scent of copal was thick enough to taste, its sweet, cloying smoke coiling around the platform like serpents, blurring the edges of the world and sealing the summit in a sacred, suffocating bubble. Cuauhtli's eyes remained open, fixed on the vast blue nothingness above. He felt no fear, only a profound and focused stillness. The chants were not noise to him. They were the architecture of the moment, the walls and roof of the sacred space being constructed around his body. He could feel the collective will of the thousands below flowing up the pyramid's sides, a river of faith converging upon this single terrible point. He was the lens through which all that human hope and terror would be focused, transformed into a sustenance the gods could understand. His own silent song joined the cacophony, a final, internal prayer of thanks as he felt the presence of the high priest move to his side, the shadow of the obsidian blade falling across his offered chest. High Priest Itzli's shadow fell across the offered chest, a dark eclipse against the painted skin. The world narrowed to the space between his hands and the altar, the roar of the crowd and the drone of the chants fading into a distant hum, a backdrop to the absolute silence of his own focused intent. In his right hand, the obsidian blade, the tekpadal, caught the thin sunlight and held it, a shard of captured night gleaming with cold purpose. His left hand settled on Cuauhtli's brow, not a gesture of comfort but of ritual placement, a final anchoring of the spirit to the flesh it was about to leave. There was no hesitation, no moment of doubt. Itzli's arm was a piston, driven by divine will, a perfect instrument of an ancient and necessary truth. The blade descended in a swift, precise arc, a movement practiced in 1,000 repetitions, honed by a lifetime of devotion. It was not a strike of anger or violence, but a surgical act of liberation, an artist's final defining stroke. The obsidian edge, sharper than any metal, met the space between the ribs with a soft, wet sigh, parting skin, muscle, and cartilage with an efficiency that was almost beautiful. It, slick with warmth, followed the path of the blade into the sacred cavity. They found what they sought, the heart, a firm, frantic drum beating its final desperate rhythm against the confines of the chest. His grip closed around it, a terrible and intimate clasp, and with a single, powerful wrench he tore it free. For a suspended moment, the heart rested in his upturned palm, a bloody, pulsating offering steaming in the cool air. It was life itself, raw and potent, the very essence of the young warrior's strength and honor. Then, in a motion as old as the gods themselves, Itzli raised his hand high toward the lethargic sun. He held the heart aloft, a dripping crimson jewel presented to the heavens. A second, more primal roar erupted from the crowd below, a wave of released tension and fervent hope that crashed against the temple walls. The blood, still warm, ran in rivulets down his arm, soaking into the sleeve of his ritual robe, a sacred anointing. He chanted the words of offering, his voice a hard, guttural force that carved the moment into eternity, presenting the tonali, the animating spirit, to the hungry god above. The ritual demanded every drop. As the heart's frantic beating stilled in his hand, Itzli turned and smeared it across the lips of the stone idol of Huitzilopochtli that stood watching from the sanctuary. The dark, porous stone drank the blood eagerly, the stark red a violent contrast against the graven image's features. The body on the altar, now an empty vessel, was released by the attending priests. The act was complete. The sun had been fed. The balance, for this moment, was restored. Itzli lowered his arm, the weight of the spent heart suddenly immense. The silence on the summit now absolute but for the distant, echoing cheers of a people granted another day of light. The body, now an empty vessel, lay still upon the blood-slicked stone, its purpose fulfilled, its sacred energy given to the sun. The attending priests, their movements reverent and efficient, released their hold on the limbs. They did not handle it as a thing of grief, but as a revered object, a husk that had contained a great and precious gift. With practiced coordination, they lifted the form, its weight a solemn burden, carried it to the very edge of the temple platform, to the top of the steep, terrifying staircase that led back down to the world of men. For a suspended moment, the body was held aloft, silhouetted against the pale sky, a final presentation to the gods and the watching city below. Then, with a single, synchronized heave, the priests cast it forward. It did not fall so much as it began a terrible, tumbling descent, a puppet with its strings cut, rolling and bouncing down the impossibly steep stone steps. The sound was a dull, rhythmic thudding, a grotesque counterpoint to the fading echoes of the crowd's roar. Each impact a stark reminder of the flesh's fragility now that the spirit had flown. The crowd watched, a collective gasp, sucked from 1,000 throats, as the honored form became a broken thing cartwheeling downward. It was a necessary part of the ritual, this violent return to earth, a symbol that the physical body was of no further consequence. Once its essence had been consumed, the descent was both brutal and sacred, a final act of separation. The soul was with the gods. The clay that had housed it was being returned to the people. At the base of the pyramid, a new group waited, veteran warriors of the Eagle and Jaguar orders, their faces set in masks of solemn duty. They did not flinch as the body landed with a final, sickening crunch on the last broad step before the plaza. They moved forward immediately, their movements crisp and respectful. They gathered the limbs, straightened the feathered headdress that had miraculously stayed partly intact, and lifted the broken form onto a waiting litter draped in embroidered cloth. This was not the end of its sacred journey. The body would be carried with honor to the priest's precinct, where it would be carefully butchered according to ancient rites. The limbs would be distributed among nobles for the ritual feast, a communion of shared strength. The head, however, would be saved, skin and flesh carefully removed to prepare the skull for its final grim resting place. The descent was not a discarding, but a transfer, the first step in the body's continued service, its parts to be used in ceremonies that would further bind the community to the gods and to the cycle of life, death, and renewal that defined their world. The blood on the steps would be washed away by temple attendants, but the memory of the body's tumbling, sacred fall would linger in the air, a powerful, visceral testament to the price of the dawn. The skull, now stripped of its flesh and cleansed of all but the faintest memory of life, was a pale, smooth orb in the hands of the skull priest. It was lighter than one might expect, a fragile-seeming vessel that had once held the dreams, courage, and sacred songs of the warrior Cuauhtli. The priest's fingers, stained dark from his grim and perpetual work, traced the empty orbits where eyes had once held the vision of a city spread out below, and the gaping nasal cavity that had drawn the last thin, smoky breaths of the summit. It was a thing of stark, brutal beauty, purified by fire and ritual, transformed from a relic of death into a symbol of cosmic sustenance. With a reverence that bordered on tenderness, the priest carried it across the sacred precinct toward the towering structure known as the Cuauhtli. The great wooden rack rose like a grim forest against the sky, a latticework of poles crochetted with horizontal beams, each one bristling with row upon row of skulls. They stared out with identical, sightless gazes. A silent multitude bearing witness to the endless hunger of the gods and the unwavering devotion of men. The air around it hummed with a palpable energy, a chilling mixture of reverence and terror, of death and the life it purchased. The priest ascended a short ladder, the skull held before him like an offering. He moved along one of the higher beams, his eyes scanning for a space among the other cranial trophies. The gaps were few. The rack was a testament to years of ceaseless ceremony. He found a place near the center, a small void between two older skulls, their bone yellowed by sun and stained by rain. With practiced hands, he carefully drilled a small hole on either side of Cuautli's skull, the sound of faint, gritty whisper. Then he slid it onto a sharpened wooden stake that protruded horizontally from the beam, pushing it firmly into place until it sat snugly between its macabre neighbors. The effect was instantaneous and complete. Cuautli's individual identity, already surrendered on the altar, was now fully absorbed into the collective. His skull became one more stark white bead in a vast, grisly rosary of sacrifice. It faced outward, toward the city and the people, its empty gaze a permanent, unblinking reminder. It spoke of the warrior's courage, yes, but more importantly, it spoke of the sun's continued journey, the rain's promised return, the fragile balance maintained by this architecture of bone. From this new vantage, the skull of Cuauhtli looked down upon the life his sacrifice sustained. It watched priests move through their duties, nobles gather for the coming feast, and commoners glance up with a shiver of awe and fear. It was no longer a part of that world of breath and heartbeat. It was a monument to it, That Cuauhtli was not a place of horror to the people below, but a grimly comforting sight. Each skull was a covenant, a receipt for a debt paid to the divine. The blank, silent faces were a promise that the world would not end, that the sun would rise again tomorrow, and that the sacred, terrible exchange of life for life would continue forever. The scent of roasting meat, rich and savory, wove through the opulent chambers of the noble's house, a stark and tantalizing contrast to the lingering aroma of Cuauhtli blood that clung to the city's sacred heart. In a spacious courtyard open to the twilight sky, the elite of Tenochtitlan gathered, their fine cotton mantles and glittering jewelry reflecting the flickering light of numerous torches. Low tables were arranged in a wide circle, laden with bowls of steaming maize, deep red sauces flavored with chilies and cocoa, and platters of fruit. But at the center of it all, resting on a bed of vivid green leaves, were the carefully butchered portions of the sacrificed warrior. These were not mere cuts of meat. They were sacred relics, imbued with the potent life force that had moments before fueled the sun. Priests from the temple, their hands still bearing the faintest traces of ritual paint, deliver them with solemn ceremony, each portion assigned to a specific noble family of high standing and proven loyalty. The flesh had been prepared with meticulous care, roasted with rare herbs and spices, whose fragrances were said to be pleasing to the gods. It was a communion not of bread and wine, but of strength and essence, a physical sharing of the divine energy that now burned within Huitzilopochtli. The nobles did not eat with the ravenous hunger of a common meal, but with a slow, deliberate reverence. Each morsel was taken with a silent prayer of gratitude, a conscious acknowledgement of the gift they were receiving. To consume this flesh was to partake in Cuautli's courage, to absorb a fraction of his sanctified strength, to bind themselves more deeply to the cosmic cycle he had completed. It was an act of profound privilege and solemn duty. Their consumption was the final, earthly step of the ritual, ensuring that not a single particle of the sacred offering was wasted, that its power was distributed among those who led and protected the people. The atmosphere was one of hushed gravitas, punctuated only by the soft crackle of torches and the careful clink of polished obsidian utensils. There was no boisterous conversation, no laughter. Instead, the nobles ate in contemplative silence, their eyes often drifting toward the temple pyramid, its silhouette a dark giant against the deepening purple of the evening sky. They were not just feeding their bodies, they were performing a sacrament. With every bite, they reaffirmed their place in the brutal, beautiful order of the world, accepting the terrible responsibility that came with their power. The feast was a covenant written in flesh, a promise to honor the sacrifice by ensuring the city, the empire, and the cosmos itself endured. As the last of the sacred meat was consumed, a deep, collective sigh seemed to pass through the gathering. The offering was complete. The sun had been fed, and its strength now flowed through the veins of its most devoted servants. The final echoes of the sacred feast faded into the deepening twilight, leaving behind a city sated yet strangely hollow its collective spirit. Stretched taut between the exaltation of the day's sacrifice and the gnawing anxiety of what was to come. As the last vestiges of the sun's borrowed strength bled from the sky, deeper, more profound ritual began to stir in the city's heart. The new fire ceremony, the most perilous of all rites, was upon them. Held only once every 52 years, it marked the end of one world cycle and the precarious birth of the next. The fate of the entire fifth sun hung in the balance. From the summit of the Templo Mayor, a single, mournful blast from a conch shell trumpet cut through the evening air. It was a sound of absolute authority, a command that brooked no hesitation. At this signal, a silent army of black-robed priests emerged from every temple and shrine in Tenochtitlan. They moved through the city's canals and streets like a tide of shadows, their faces grim, their hands bearing clay pots of water and heavy smothering cloths. Their mission was one of terrifying finality, the utter extinction of every flame in the empire. They entered homes, royal palaces, and artisan workshops alike. There was no distinction between noble and commoner in this sacred duty. In every hearth, from the grandest to the most humble, the priests doused the dancing flames. They poured water over cooking fires, snuffed out oil lamps with their damp cloths, and overturned braziers, scattering the glowing embers and stamping them into cold, black ash. A collective gasp of loss followed in their wake, a citywide inhalation of dread as the familiar, comforting light of fire, the very symbol of life. Warmth and civilization was systematically erased. Windows and doorways were sealed with clay. All pottery was broken. All household idols were cast down. Pregnant women were locked in granaries, feared as potential portals for the star demons should the ceremony fail. The city plunged into a silence so complete it was a physical presence, a heavy blanket smothering sound and hope alike. The only illumination came from the cold, distant stars and a sliver of moon, their light doing little to pierce the profound blackness that had swallowed the great city. Tenochtitlan, the glittering jewel of the lake, became a void, a place of held breath and whispered prayers. Its people huddled together in the dark, waiting for a spark that would mean either their salvation or their eternal end. The world had been unmade. All that remained was the terrible, uncertain wait for it to be born again. On the Hill of the Star, a distant and sacred peak far from the extinguished heart of Tenochtitlan, a single point of light defied the all-consuming darkness. A small group of priests, their faces gaunt with fasting and their eyes burning with fervent purpose, tended a tiny, perfect flame in a stone basin. It was the last fire in the world, a fragile, flickering soul kept alive through meticulous care and ceaseless prayer. This was the sacred flame of the god Cuauhtli, the old god of fire, preserved for this precise, terrifying moment. The fate of the fifth son now rested on the speed and strength of a single man. The chosen runner stood at the base of the hill, his body naked but for a loincloth, his skin gleaming with ritual oils in the faint starlight. He was not a warrior, but a Ahuyani, a professional messenger renowned for his endurance and unwavering spirit. His lungs were vast bellows, his legs cords of hardened muscle, his heart a steady drum tuned to the rhythm of the long road. The high priest of the hill approached him, bearing a clay brazier in which the sacred flame had been carefully transferred, its light dancing in the runner's determined eyes. With a final guttural invocation, the priest lit a tightly bound bundle of pitch pine torches from the divine fire. The flames caught with a hungry hiss, casting long, leaping shadows against the surrounding rocks. He pressed the burning bundle into the runner's waiting hands. There was no speech, no ceremony beyond this. The weight of the world was passed in that single gesture. The runner's fingers closed around the rough wood, feeling the heat of the newborn sun against his palms. Then he turned and he ran. He flew down the darkened path, his torch a streaking comet against the black velvet of the night. His feet, calloused and sure, found every stone, every root, every dip in the ancient trail. He did not run from something, but toward everything, toward the waiting, breathless city, toward the future of his people, toward the dawn of a new cycle. The wind of his own passage whipped the flames, and he held the torch aloft, a moving star against the static ones above, a promise carried on the wind. All through the long, desperate night, the people of Tenochtitlan waited in the suffocating dark, their eyes straining toward the eastern causeway. They prayed, they held their children close, they listened for the sound that would mean their world would continue. Then, just as the first faint gray smear of false dawn touched the horizon, a pinpoint of light appeared in the distance. It grew steadily larger, resolving into the shape of a man moving with impossible speed, a blazing brand held high above his head. Sound began to build in the city, a low, universal moan of relief, and burgeoning joy that swelled into a thunderous, ecstatic roar as the runner pounded onto the main causeway. Priests and nobles rushed to meet him, their own unlit torches held out like begging hands. He did not stop, but touched his divine flame to the first of theirs, and then the next, and the next. The fire leaped from torch to torch, a chain of light racing ahead of him into the city's heart, flowing through the streets like liquid life. He ran straight to the summit of the Templo Mayor, where the high priest Itzli waited. The runner, his chest heaving, his body slick with sweat and lit by the glorious fire he carried, thrust the torch toward the altar. Itzli took it, his hands trembling not with age, but with reverence, and touched it to the unlit brazier of the great temple. The flame roared to life. Below, 1,000 new fires were kindled in hearths and temples across the city, pushing back the darkness, filling the world with light and warmth and sound. The sun had been fed, and now, miraculously, it would rise again. The new cycle had begun. The thunderous, hypnotic rhythm of the drum was not a call to prayer, but to play. It echoed across the vast eye-shaped court, its beat as primal as a heartbeat, setting the pace for a contest where the stakes were not mere victory but life itself. The great ball court of Tenochtitlan was a canyon of carved stone. Its towering walls sloped and adorned with stone rings high above the playing surface. In the center, two teams faced each other, their bodies gleaming with sweat and intricate paint, their eyes fixed not on each other, but on the heavy, solid rubber ball that rested between them like a dormant god. This was no simple game. It was a reenactment of the eternal struggle between the forces of light and darkness, a cosmic battle played out with human bodies. The players, powerful athletes chosen for their skill and strength, were proxies for the gods themselves. They wore thick leather guards on their hips and knees, their only armor against the devastating impact of the ball, which could stun or maim with its weight. The rules were brutal and unforgiving. The ball could not be touched with hands or feet, only struck with hips, thighs, and elbows, kept in constant dizzying motion, a black sun careening between the teams. The game began. The heavy sphere was put into play, and instantly the court became a blur of controlled violence. Athletes hurled themselves through the air, twisting their bodies to slam hips against the ball, sending it rocketing toward the opposing side with a sound like a fist striking stone. They dove and rolled on the hard surface, their skin scraping, their breath coming in ragged grunts. The crowd that packed the stone benches high above roared with every near miss, every spectacular save, every thunderous impact. They were not just spectators, they were witnesses to a divine drama, their cheers and gasps a part of the ritual. The play was fierce and unrelenting, a test of endurance and will as much as skill. Points were scored rarely, a moment of triumph when a team managed to drive the ball past the opponent's end line. But the ultimate sacred victory was to somehow propel the heavy sphere through one of the stone rings high on the wall of feet, so rare it was seen as a direct sign of divine favor. As the game wore on under the relentless sun, the players' energy began to flag. Mistakes were made. Misjudged leap, a slow reaction, a fumbled return. The balance of the cosmic struggle was tipping. Finally, it was over. One team, battered and exhausted, had been decisively outplayed. They knelt on the hot stone, heads bowed, their chests heaving. There was no shame in their posture, only a solemn acceptance. The captain of the winning team approached them, not with triumph, but with a grave reverence. He placed a hand on the shoulder of the losing captain. The roar of the crowd softened into a unified, expectant hum. The game was decided. The cosmic battle had its losers. And in the sacred logic of the court, the losers had a final, glorious role to play. They had fought valiantly in the divine struggle, and their strength, their very lives, would now be offered to ensure the sun's continued victory over the night. The ball game was over. The sacrifice was about to begin. The air in the sacred precinct held a different quality today, a metallic temps of impending transformation that set it apart from the clear, sharp urgency of a sun sacrifice, or the hushed dread of the new fire ceremony. This was the festival of Tlaquetzapolisli, the feast of the flaying of men, and its purpose was not merely to feed a hungry god, but to become him. The focus was not on the summit of the great temple, but on a smaller, circular stone dais before the shrine of Totec, our Lord, the Flayed One, the god of spring, of renewal, of the seed that must break open its outer shell to release new life. Upon the dais, a single figure stood, his body painted a stark, brilliant yellow, the color of ripe maize. This was not a warrior of renown like Cuauhtli, but a captive taken in the last flower war, a strong-limbed man from a rival city-state. His name, his past, his personal fears, all had been stripped from him over days of purification. He was no longer a man, but a canvas, an empty vessel, waiting to be filled with the essence of the god. His eyes, though wide, held a glazed acceptance. He had been fed the finest foods, treated with a strange, reverent courtesy, and taught the steps of the ritual dance he would perform. He understood his role in the great, grotesque metaphor of renewal. Priests in elaborate costumes resembling flayed skins, their own bodies painted beneath the loose, fleshy-looking leather, moved around him in a slow, shuffling dance. They chanted not to Huitzilopochtli, but to Totec, blazes for his terrible gift of renewal, acknowledgments of the suffering that preceded all new growth. The rhythm was slower, more deliberate than the war drums of the sun ceremony, a pulsating beat that evoked the slow, inevitable push of a sprout through the earth. The climax of the ceremony approached. The chanting rose in pitch and intensity. Two senior priests approached the captive then impersonator, their hands not holding an obsidian blade, but something equally potent, a folded bundle of leathery, tanned skin. It was the skin of a sacrifice from the previous year's festival, carefully preserved and treated with sacred oils. It was stiff, yet pliable, a ghastly, hairless second skin that held the residual sanctity of its previous wearer. With movements that were both ritualistic and strangely practical, they began to dress the living man in the skin of the dead. They started with the legs, pulling the tight, leathery stockings over his own limbs, the cold, unnatural embrace eliciting an involuntary shudder that he quickly suppressed. The fit was eerily precise, the skin clinging to his own like a damp, morbid glove. The priests worked upward, smoothing the torso piece over his chest and back, the empty sac of the previous sacrifice's form molding to his own musculature. The arms followed, each finger of the flayed skin carefully fitted over his own. Finally, they lifted the mask. The face of the flayed skin, with its hollow eye sockets and stitched-shut mouth, was a terrifying sight. As they lowered it over the captive's head, the world outside disappeared, replaced by a dim, suffocating darkness that smelled of tannin and old, sacred death. He was now fully encased. He was no longer a man wearing a skin. He was the skin given life again. He was Totec incarnate, a walking, breathing symbol of the horrifying truth that new life could only emerge from the death and shedding of the old. The god of spring had arrived, and his garment was the flesh of a man who had walked this same path one cycle before. The dance of renewal was about to begin. Cased in the cold, leathery second skin of a man long sacrificed, the impersonator of Totec began to move. The dance was not one of joy or celebration, but a slow, shuffling, grotesque pantomime of growth. His movements were stiff, constrained by the tight, cured hide that encased him like a burial shroud worn on the outside. Each step, each deliberate turn of his shrouded head was a performance of the seed cracking open, the new plant straining against the confining earth, the painful, necessary shedding that preceded all renewal. The priests in their own imitation skins circled him, their chants a low, droning accompaniment to his macabre ballet, their voices weaving a spell of transformation around the dais. For 20 days he would wear this skin, this sacred and horrific garment. He was treated as the god himself, fed choice foods and paraded through the city's districts. Children would stare with wide, uncomprehending eyes, and adults would bow their heads in a mixture of reverence and revulsion. The sight was meant to be unsettling, a visceral, unforgettable lesson that the bounty of the coming season, the maize that would feed the people, was born from a cycle of death and flaying. The god's appearance was a promise and a warning, a testament to the brutal truth of their existence. The skin began to change over the days, drying tighter under the sun, cracking at the joints and emitting a faint, sweetly rancid odor of preservation and slow decay. Was a constant physical reminder of the mortality he wore and the immortality he represented. Then, on the 20th day, the final act of the ritual commenced. The impersonator was led back to the circular dais, his sacred duty nearly complete. The same priests who addressed him now approached with flint knives, their edges gleaming with a purpose different from the heart-cutting blade of the sun priest. Theirs was not an act of offering, but of unveiling. With a sacred solemnity that bordered on tenderness, they began to make careful incisions in the tight, dried skin. They did not rip or tear, but peeled with a ritual precision, starting at the seams they had created weeks before. The sound was a low, gritty rasp, the parting of cured leather from living flesh. As the mask was lifted from his head, the man blinked in the sudden, blinding light, his own face pale and strangely vulnerable after so long in darkness. The torso piece came away, then the leggings, each section pulled back to reveal the smooth, unmarked skin beneath, which had been protected and purified by its confinement. The old skin, the symbol of death in the past year, was shed. The man beneath, now shivering and raw, was revealed a symbol of the new life that emerged, pristine and full of potential. The flayed skin was gathered by the priests with utmost reverence. It would be treated with oils, cut into small strips, and distributed to farmers to be buried in their fields, a potent charm to ensure fertility and a bountiful harvest. The god had been honored, the cycle of death and rebirth made terrifyingly manifest. Renewal had been purchased once again with a skin. The air in the sacred precinct grew heavy, thick with the scent of wet earth and the promise of storms. The sky above Tenochtitlan was not the clear, demanding blue of Cuauhtli's domain, but a low, bruised gray, pregnant with unshed rain. The crowd that gathered was different too. Their fervor was not the roaring, sun-hungry need of the warrior sacrifice, but a quieter, more desperate anxiety. They stood in hushed clusters, their eyes fixed on the smaller, blue-painted temple of Tloak, the god of rain, fertility, and the life-giving waters that could just as easily become floods of destruction. Today's offering was not for the sun, but for the clouds, and it demanded a different kind of purity. The child was brought forward, a small boy of perhaps 5 or 6 summers. He was not a warrior, but his selection was no less meticulous. He had been chosen for his flawless skin, his 2 perfect cowlicks of hair that mirrored the swirling patterns of water, and most importantly for his birth date, which the calendar priests had determined made his spirit especially pleasing to the capricious rain god. He was dressed not in feathers and gold, but in a simple white robe, and his small hands clutched a handful of bright yellow flowers, their petals a stark contrast to the grimness of the occasion. He did not fully understand the honor being bestowed upon him, only that he was the center of a great and solemn attention, and he had been told he would make the clouds happy. The priests of Tloak. Their robes, the deep blue of lake water, and their faces covered in masks of goggle-eyed serpents, took the child's hands. Their touch was not unkind, but it was firm, guiding him toward a large, ornately carved jar that stood at the base of the temple steps. The jar was not an altar for a blade, but a container, a symbolic womb of water and earth. As they lifted him, a low, mournful chant began. A different rhythm from the war drums of the sun god, this was a pulsing liquid cadence, the sound of falling rain and flowing rivers given voice. They placed the child inside the jar, seating him within its ceramic embrace. He looked small and fragile, his wide eyes peering over the rim at the sea of solemn faces. Then the priests began to bring their offerings. They did not bring weapons, but gifts. They poured jars of pure water over his head, a chilling baptism that made the child gasp and shiver. They scattered kernels of multicolored maize around his feet and laid down bundles of ripe vegetables and fragrant herbs. He was being presented not as a morsel for a hungry god, but as the most precious seed in a divine garden, a perfect offering to ensure the fertility of all seeds to come. It was then that the tears began. Whether from the shock of the cold water, the confusion of the ritual, or some deep, conscious understanding, the child's lower lip trembled. Fat, glistening tears welled in his eyes, overflowed, and traced clean paths down his rain-dampened cheeks. A ripple of fervent, hopeful murmuring passed through the crowd. The priests' masked faces tilted upward, a gesture of profound gratitude. The child's tears were the most potent omen possible, a sacred sympathy with the element he was being offered to. His crying was not a sign of distress to be quelled, but a prayer to be encouraged, a perfect mirror of the rains they so desperately needed. The lid was placed upon the jar, sealing the child in a dark, damp, earthy space. The chanting rose to a crescendo, a fervent plea to Tloak to accept this perfect, weeping offering and to open the skies in return. The jar, now a living tomb and a sacred vessel of potential, was carried by the priests into the inner sanctum of the temple, away from public view. There it would be kept, and the child within would be left to his fate, not a violent end, but a slow, sacred transformation, his tears and his life merging with the elements to coax the rain from the stubborn, gray sky. The people dispersed, their hearts lighter, looking up at the clouds with a new, desperate hope. The child had cried, surely the god would answer. The scent of old blood and damp stone was a presence in the small, windowless chamber, a perfume of sanctity and slaughter that clung to the back of the throat and seeped into the soul. Cuauhtli, a novice priest of barely 16 summers, knelt on the cold floor, his young body aching with a fatigue that was more spiritual than physical. Before him, laid out on a low stone slab with a reverence that felt like a mockery, were the remains of the warrior from the morning's sacrifice. Not the whole body that had been distributed according to sacred custom, but the parts that were left. The emptied torso, the bones now picked clean by ritual knives in reverent hands, the silent staring skull that had not yet earned its place on the Tzampana. These were the echoes of the man who had been Cuauhtli, the honored one, the sun's sustenance. His duty was to keep vigil, to ensure no malevolent spirit or impious creature disturbed these sacred relics before they were prepared for their final rites. A single oil lamp guttered on the floor beside him, its flickering light dancing over the stark white curves of bone and the dark hollow cavities where life had once resided. The flame cast long, wavering shadows that made the remains seem to shift and breathe in the corner of his vision. Xochitl's task was to contemplate the divine mystery of the sacrifice, to meditate on the glorious transition of a warrior spirit to the House of the Sun. He had been taught that this was the highest honor, a beautiful and necessary exchange that held the stars in their courses. But as the hours stretched in the suffocating silence, the teachings of his elders began to curdle in his mind. The glorious transition felt, in this close, bloody air, like a brutal ending. The beautiful exchange looked like butchery. He stared at the skull, and instead of seeing a symbol of cosmic balance, he saw the shape of a man's head, a head that had once held thoughts, memories, a favorite song. The empty rib cage was not a sacred chalice that had held a god's meal. It was a cage that had once protected a beating heart, a heart that had surely pulsed with fear and pride and love on that final ascent. A cold tremor, unrelated to the chamber's chill, ran through him. This was the thin, sharp edge of the blade that divided his world. On one side was the reverence, the unquestioning faith in the priests, the awe of the rituals, the desperate, communal need that made such acts not just acceptable, but holy. He had felt that awe himself, watching the processions, hearing the chants, believing in the sublime purpose of it all. But on the other side of the blade was the horror of the raw, physical reality of the torn flesh. The smell of voided organs, the profound, crushing silence of a life extinguished. The two truths were irreconcilable, and he was trapped between them, his faith shivering like his lamp's fragile flame. He reached out a trembling hand, stopping just short of touching the cool, smooth bone of the skull. Was this truly the only way? Was the universe so fragile, so desperately thirsty, that it required this endless river of blood to keep from collapsing? Or was it something else, a darkness, not in the stars, but in the hearts of men, a fear so great it could only be answered with ever greater acts of violence? The questions were a sacrilege, a poison in the sacred space, and he tried to force them down to recapture the pure, fervent belief he had felt during the new fire ceremony. But the image of the child in the rain jar, his small face wet with terrified tears that were celebrated as a blessing, rose unbidden in his mind. Xochitl bowed his head, his forehead nearly touching the cold stone floor. He did not pray. He simply knelt in the presence of the remains, bearing witness to the terrible contradiction at the heart of his world. The vigil was meant to strengthen his resolve, to harden him for a lifetime of service. But as the long night wore on, it only carved a hollow of doubt within him, a silent space where reverence and horror met and bled into one another, forever changing the novice who kept watch in the dark. The air in the innermost sanctum of the temple was thick and heavy, palpable fog of copal smoke and latent power that clung to the skin and filled the lungs with the taste of the divine. The oracle, a woman so ancient her name had been forgotten and replaced by her title, sat motionless on a woven mat before a shallow basin of obsidian black water. Her eyes, clouded by years and visions, were fixed on the dark, unmoving surface. Around her, the world had been silenced, the distant city sounds. The shuffle of priestly feet, even her own breath, seemed suspended in the expectant hush. She had fasted for 3 days, drunk the sacred brew of morning glory seeds, and chanted the old words until her voice was a rasp. Now she waited. The gods did not answer summons. They arrived in their own time, and their messages were never gentle. It began not as a sight, but as a sensation deep. resonant hum that started in the marrow of her bones and vibrated outward, making the water in the basin shiver. The black surface rippled, not from any physical touch, but from a pressure building within the very air. Then the images came, not as clear pictures, but as violent, overwhelming impressions that slammed into her consciousness. She saw the sun, not weak and pale as it had been, but guttering like a dying torch, its light faltering, its edges crumbling into ash and void. A cold so profound it felt like the end of time seeped from the vision, frosting the stone beneath her and locking the breath in her chest. The hunger she felt next was not her own. It was a vast, celestial emptiness, a yawning chasm of need that dwarfed the ocean and swallowed the stars. It was the sun's hunger, but magnified 1,000-fold, a desperate, ravening void that could not be filled by the trickle of offerings they had provided. The vision shifted, and she saw the great Cuauhtli, but its poles were bare, the skulls gone, the wood bleached and cracking under a relentless dead sky. The message was not a request. It was a ultimatum. The current pace of sacrifice was an insult. The debt was compounding. Gods demanded more, not just more captives from the flower wars, but a deluge. A great flowing river of the most potent life, the strongest warriors, the purest children, the noblest lords. The scale of the demand was staggering, a numbers of lives so vast it made her ancient soul tremble. A violent shudder racked her frail body, and the connection broke. She gasped, sucking in the smoky air as if drowning, her hands flying to her chest, where her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The water in the basin was still once more, dark and depthless. For a long moment, she could only kneel, trembling. The horrific after-images of the dying sun and the insatiable void burned onto the back of her eyes. The silence in the chamber was no longer expectant. It was accusatory. With an effort that drained the last of her strength, she pushed herself upright. Her limbs felt like water, but her duty was clear. She stumbled to the entrance of the sanctum and pushed the heavy woven curtain aside. The 2 junior priests, assigned to guard her, turned, their faces expectant. The oracle did not speak. She did not need to. The terror was etched into every line of her face, a silent scream that was more eloquent than any words. She merely lifted a trembling hand and pointed toward the chamber where the ruling council was in session. The message was in her eyes, in the pallor of her skin, in the absolute dread that radiated from her. The gods had spoken. The price for survival had just been raised beyond imagining, and they had very little time to pay it. The world was a jolting, bruising rhythm of wood and sinew, a cage of rough-hewn poles that bit into his back with every step the porters took. Malinali, a warrior of the Tlaxcalan people, hung suspended between 2 burly Aztec soldiers, his wrists bound tightly behind him, his body a canvas of fresh wounds and old pride. The scent of his own blood, coppery and stark, mingled with the sweat of his captors and the dust of the road. He had fought well in the Flower War, his Cuauhtli, claiming its own prizes, before a skilled Eagle Knight had disarmed and overwhelmed him. Capture, not death, had been the goal of the ritual battle, and he had become its currency. His world had shrunk to the confines of this carrying frame. The view limited to the swaying backs of the warriors ahead and the endless trampled earth of the causeway stretching behind. But as the journey wore on, the quality of the earth began to change. The packed dirt of the countryside gave way to finely laid stonework. The air, once carrying the clean scents of pine and distant rain, grew thick with the smells of dense humanity smoke, cooking maize, blooming flowers on the water, and the underlying, ever-present temps of the lake itself. Then he saw it. A collective gasp, quickly stifled, rustled through the column of captives. The head rising from the glittering expanse of Lake Texcoco was a vision that seemed torn from a legend. Tenochtitlan. It was not a city. It was a mountain range crafted by gods and men. Its whitewashed temples and adobe buildings sprawling across a network of islands and canals, all connected by long, straight causeways teeming with life. At its heart, the twin pyramids of the Templo Mayor clawed at the sky, their summits wreathed in a perpetual haze of sacred smoke. The scale of it was staggering, a display of power so absolute it felt like a physical blow. This was not just a city. It was an empire made stone and water, a testament to the people who had subdued his own and countless others. The causeway led them directly into the city's throbbing heart. The noise was the first to assault a cacophony of thousands of voices. The splash of countless canoes in the canals, the distant beat of drums from temple precincts. The causeway itself was a river of humanity, and as the procession of captives moved through it, they became the focus of 1,000 staring eyes. But the looks were not of hatred or scorn. They were gazes of appraisal, of reverence, of a strange, hungry gratitude. Men and women alike looked upon the bound warriors not as enemies, but as sacred objects, vital components in a great celestial machine they all depended upon. They were walking proof of Aztec might, yes, but more importantly, they were walking sustenance for the gods. Malinali saw the evidence of that piety everywhere. They passed smaller temples where the air shimmered with heat from unseen braziers. He caught glimpses of priests in elaborate feathered regalia, moving with solemn purpose. And once carried on a litter by a procession of chanting figures, he saw a man dressed in the flayed skin of another. A living nightmare of renewal that made his blood run cold despite the heat. This was not a city that worshipped its gods from a quiet distance. It was a city that fed them, constantly and publicly, in a cycle of blood and smoke that was as visible as the canals themselves. The immense power on display was not just military or architectural, it was spiritual, a terrifying confidence that they alone understood the brutal necessities of keeping the world alive. He was not just a prisoner of war, he was a captive of an entire worldview, and his journey was taking him directly to its bloody, beating heart. The procession slowed as it entered the vast ceremonial plaza at the city's heart, the air thickening with the scent of copal and the palpable weight of thousands of watching eyes. Malinali's frame was lowered to the ground, his bonds cut, and he was pulled roughly to his feet. For a moment, his legs buckled, unaccustomed to bearing his own weight after the long, cramped journey. Strong hands gripped his arms, not to harm him, but to present him. He was no longer a captive in transit. He was an offering on display. They forced him to walk the final distance to the base of the Templo Mayor, a gauntlet of awe and judgment. The crowd lining the route was a living wall of sound and motion. Some spat curses in his direction, their faces contorted with the inherited hatred of generations of warfare. They saw only the enemy, the Tlaxcalan dog, who had dared raise a weapon against the children of Huitzilopochtli. Their scorn was a physical thing, a heat on his skin. But for every face twisted in contempt, another held a look of stark, unnerving admiration. Warriors of the Eagle and Jaguar orders watched him pass, their arms crossed, their gazes measuring his strength, his posture the unbroken defiance in his eyes. They saw a worthy opponent, a soul of such potency that his sacrifice would be a rich meal for the gods. Their respect was colder and more frightening than any hatred. Children pointed with curious eyes, women offered silent prayers, and priests nodded with professional approval, already assessing the quality of the life force that pulsed within him. He was a spectacle, a living lesson in the Empire's power and piety, a walking symbol of the brutal exchange that kept their world turning. He was both reviled and revered, a condemned man and a consecrated object, and the dissonance of it churned in his gut. His fate was not his own. It was a public property, a story already written in which he was but a crucial character. The journey ended at the foot of the pyramid. The immense stone staircase rose before him like a mountain, its summit lost in the haze of sacred smoke. The roar of the crowd faded into a unified, expectant hum. The priests who held him tightened their grip, their fingers like stone. They turned him to face the multitude one last time. His eyes swept over the sea of faces, the scornful, the reverent, the merely curious, and the immense, terrifying city beyond. This was the pinnacle of his people's enemy, a civilization built on a foundation of captured warriors like himself. He had been paraded through its might, faced its complex contempt, and now stood at the threshold of its most sacred act. His fate, debated and admired by the crowd, was now sealed. He was here for one purpose only. The journey was over. The ascent was about to begin. The battlefield was a stage, and the warriors were actors in a drama of life and death, with a script written by the gods themselves. It was not a field of conquest or a struggle for land, but a sacred arena, meticulously chosen on the borderlands between the Aztec Empire and the defiant state of Tlaxcala. The air did not crackle with the raw hatred of total war, but thrummed with a tense, ritualized energy. The warriors, adorned in the brilliant feathered regalia of the eagle and jaguar orders, did not fight to kill, but to capture. Their obsidian-edged clubs, the Cuauhtlis, were swung not to shatter skulls, but to stun and subdue. The goal was not territory, but prisoners, living, breathing offerings to fuel the insatiable celestial machinery. From a low hill overlooking the arranged conflict, High Priest Itzli watched with a critical, measuring eye. This was the Exioyo, the Flower War, a sacred agreement between enemies to provide the gods with a steady harvest of the most potent sustenance, the life force of strong, valiant warriors. The choreography of the battle was both brutal and beautiful. Warriors paired off in a deadly dance, their movements a blend of martial skill and ritual performance. The thud of wooden shields meeting, the grunts of exertion, the whistle of clubs cutting the air, it was a symphony of controlled violence. A fighter would disarm his opponent, grapple him to the earth, and bind his wrists with tough maguey fiber, all while avoiding a lethal blow. The captive's resistance was part of the ritual, a proof of his strength and worth. Itzli's gaze followed a young eagle knight as he expertly tripped a Tlaxcalan warrior, pinning him swiftly. The priest's satisfaction was not one of military victory, but of spiritual procurement. Each captured warrior represented another sunrise, another season of rain, another turn of the great cycle. The war was a grim form of agriculture, and these men were the most sacred of crops, cultivated not from soil, but from the arranged conflict between rival nations. The Tlaxcalans understood this as well. They fought with equal fervor to take their own captives, to feed their own gods, to ensure their own survival. It was a mutual, desperate pact, a recognition that the cosmos demanded a price in blood, and this was the most efficient way to pay it. As the sun began to sink, painting the ritual field in hues of orange and blood red, the battle concluded not with a rout, but with a withdrawal. Both sides fell back, dragging their bound, struggling prizes with them. There were no cheers of victory, no lamentations for the lost. There was only the grim tally of the taken. Itzli watched the Aztec column form up, perhaps 24 strong captives now part of their procession. They would be marched back to Tenochtitlan, not to dungeons, but to purification cells. Their fate was not one of punishment, but of supreme honor. They had been chosen on the field of ritual combat, their strength deemed worthy of sustaining the very sun. The flower war was over, its bloody harvest was secured, the wheels of sacrifice could turn once more. The signs were subtle at first, whispers on the wind that only the most attuned could decipher. A sudden unnatural chill in the air during the height of the day, the scent of damp earth and decay rising from the dry stones of the temple precinct, the frantic, disorganized flight of hummingbirds, messengers of the sun, as if startled by an unseen predator. For the priests dedicated to the Earth Mother Cuauhtli, these were not mere oddities. They were a language, a desperate and growing agitation from the depths. The goddess of the earth, the mother of gods, the one whose skirt was of writhing serpents, was stirring. At her restlessness was a portent of terrible need. High Priest Itzli convened the senior priests in a chamber deep beneath the Templo Mayor, a place where the sounds of the city faded into a profound silence, broken only by the drip of groundwater. The air was heavy, cool, and carried the ancient smell of deep soil and stone. They gathered around a simple clay vessel filled with water from the sacred spring of Chapultepec. For hours they sat in silent meditation, their breaths slowing, their senses extending beyond the physical, seeking the source of the disturbance. Itzli's mind, weary from a lifetime of interpreting divine whims, felt the shift first to deep, grinding hunger, not the sharp solar need of Huitzilopochtli, but a vast subterranean ache, a yearning for a different kind of offering. This was not about light, but about foundation. It's not about the sky, but about the soil that gave everything life. The message coalesced not in words, but in a series of overwhelming sensations that passed between the priests in the shared silence. They saw visions of cracked, barren earth, of roots withering before they could bear fruit, of the very ground beneath Tenochtitlan turning to dust and ash. The hunger they felt was primal, maternal, and utterly insatiable. Cuauhtli, the giver of life, required sustenance to continue giving. But her demand was not for the blood of warriors or the tears of children. Her appetite was for something more profound, more intimately connected to the essence of creation itself. The offering had to be one of absolute purity and potent life, a sacrifice that would seep into the bedrock and nourish the roots of the world. A consensus formed without a single word being spoken. The priests opened their eyes, their faces pale and grave. The signs were clear and urgent. Earth Mother demanded a special offering, a ritual not performed in generations. It was to be a ceremony of deepest secrecy and power, conducted not under the blazing sun for all to see, but in the womb of the earth itself, under the blanket of a moonless midnight sky. The chosen one would not ascend a pyramid, but descend into a sacred cenote, a natural well that was a doorway to the underworld and a direct conduit to the goddess. The purpose was not to send a spirit to the heavens, but to return a potent life to the source from which all life sprang. The decision was made. The priests dispersed to make the somber preparations, the weight of the earth's demand settling upon their shoulders like a mantle of stone. The city above, oblivious, slept on, while beneath its foundations. Plans were laid for a sacrifice that would touch the very core of their world. The moon was a thief that night, stealing away with its sliver of light and leaving the world to a darkness so profound it felt like a weight upon the chest. Tenochtitlan, usually a constellation of hearth fires and temple braziers, lay under a suffocating blackness. Its canals ink-black ribbons, its towering pyramids mere hints of deeper shadow against the starless sky. This was no ordinary night. It was a time between times, a crack in the world where the old deep powers stirred, and the city, for once, was not meant to witness the transaction meant to ensure its survival. Far from the central plaza, in a grove of ancient cypresses that whispered secrets to the still water of a secluded cenote, a different kind of sanctity was being invoked. The air here was cold and carried the rich, loamy scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, a stark contrast to the dry, smoky aroma of the Sun Temple. Torches, few and strategically placed, did little to push back the night, instead creating a small, flickering island of light that seemed to emphasize the immense darkness pressing in from all sides. Their flames guttered in the faint, subterranean breath rising from the water's surface, casting long, dancing shadows that looked less like men and more like the writhing serpents of the goddess's skirt. The priests of Cuauhtli moved with a silent, grave purpose, their robes the color of dark soil, their faces smeared with ash and powdered jade. There was no drum, no chanting crowd, no grand procession. The only sounds were the lap of water against stone, the hiss of the torches, and the low guttural hum of a single priest's invocation, sound so deep it seemed to vibrate up from the earth itself. The ritual was one of roots and silence, of the hidden things that nourish the world unseen. The chosen one stood at the water's edge, a young man selected not for his prowess in battle, but for his unbroken lineage, his physical perfection, and a birthmark that mirrored the shape of a sprouting maize seed. He was the embodiment of potential life, the perfect offering to the mother who gave it. He was naked but for a loincloth, his skin painted with intricate patterns of brown and green, symbols of the fertile earth and the growing things that sprang from it. He did not look toward the city he was dying to save. His eyes were fixed on the black, still water of the cenote, a doorway to the underworld and the heart of the goddess. The high priest of the earth cult approached, not with an obsidian blade, but with a cord woven from maguey fiber and night-blooming flowers. He looped it around the young man's wrists, not to bind him, but to connect him, a symbolic root tying the offering to the source. The humming ceased. In the absolute silence that followed, the priest placed his hands on the young man's shoulders, a final grounding touch. Then, with a strength that belied his age, he guided him forward, into the water. The cenote was shockingly cold, a gasp of winter in the tropical night. The young man did not resist, wading deeper until the black, peat-stained water rose to his chest, then his chin. He took one last, shuddering breath of the world of air, his eyes wide and unseeing in the torchlight. Then he was under. The water closed over his head without a splash, swallowing him into its silent, frigid embrace. There was no struggle, no violent end, only a slow, sacred sinking, a return. The ripples spread outward, gently caressing the stone sides of the well, before the water grew still once more, holding its secret. The priests extinguished the torches, one by one, plunging the grove back into the perfect, consuming darkness from which it had been briefly carved. The offering had been made. No heart was held aloft, no blood stained an altar. The life had been given directly back to the earth, a seed planted in the deepest soil, to ensure the continued fertility of the world above. The midnight rite was complete. The goddess, they prayed, was satisfied, and in the silent, sleeping city, none knew the price that had just been paid for the ground beneath their feet. In a small, smoke-blackened workshop, tucked away from the main temple thoroughfares, a different kind of priest practiced his devotion. He was not a chanter of hymns or a wielder of the sacrificial blade, but a shaper of the divine instrument itself. His name was irrelevant. He was known only as the Master Napper, and his world was the glassy, volcanic heart of the gods. All around him, in neat leather pouches and woven baskets, lay his medium. Chunks of raw obsidian, hauled from distant mountains. To the uninitiated, they were just black rocks. To him they were slumbering vessels of celestial power, each one holding a silent, lethal potential waiting for his hands to awaken it. His tools were simple and antler tine, a rounded river stone, a pad of worn leather to protect his palm. But in his hands they became extensions of a will that was both artist and acolyte. He selected a core of obsidian, its surface a swirl of deep black and smoky transparency. He held it not as a stone, but as a sacred egg. His breathing slowed, his focus narrowing to the point where his antler tine would make contact. This was not a craft. It was a conversation with the stone, a listening for the fault lines hidden within, the pathways the blade itself wished to take. The first strike was a precise, calculated tap. A small flake sheared away with a sound like ice cracking, revealing a surface as smooth and sharp as a frozen lake. He did not force the shape, followed the stone's own logic, tapping and pressing, each movement removing a tiny sliver of glass, guiding the form emerging from the core. He was not carving so much as revealing, uncovering the blade that had always been imprisoned within the rock. A curve began to form, the lethal sweep of the Tenochtitlan's edge, its surface catching the dim light from the single window and holding it in a deep, liquid gleam. Da-da-da-da, as he worked, he chanted under his breath, not the grand invocations of the temple summit, but the quiet, personal prayers of his craft. He prayed to Tezcatlipoca, the smoke-in mirror, whose essence was said to reside in obsidian. He asked the god to guide his hand, to lend the blade a fragment of his own dark power, to make it not just sharp, but holy. He believed that with every flake that fell away, a little of his own spirit was invested into the tool, and a little of the god's essence was invited in. The finished blade would not be a mere knife. It would be a partnership, his skill, the stone's perfection, and a sliver of divine will. Hours passed. A pile of sharp, glittering flakes at his feet grew, and the core in his hand transformed. What remained was a thing of stark, deadly beauty, a length of volcanic glass, honed to an edge finer than any metal could achieve. It surfaced a cascade of tiny ripples from the flaking process, like water frozen in a black waterfall. He held it up, turning it slowly. It was perfect. It felt light, almost hungry in his hand. He could feel the sacred potential humming within it, a silent promise of the swift, clean cut it would deliver. He would wrap it in soft cloth and present it to the temple attendants, who would carry it to the high priest for blessing. His work was done. He had not chosen the victim, chanted the prayers, or wielded the blade. But he had shaped the instrument that would bridge the gap between the human and the divine. In the moment of sacrifice, when the priest's hand closed around the hilt he had crafted, part of him would be there to his silent prayer for the cosmos, joining the louder ones, his art becoming an essential sharp-edged note in the eternal song of blood and stars. The air in the noble's courtyard was thick with the cloying sweetness of copal and the sharp metallic scent of impending pain. It was a different kind of sacrifice, not one performed on the summit for all to see, but a private solemn duty behind high walls, where the elite of Tenochtitlan paid their own blood tax to the gods. They did not offer the lives of others here, but their own essence, drawn forth in a ritual of auto-sacrifice that was as intimate as it was excruciating. The nobles stood in silent rows, men and women of high birth and immense privilege, their fine cotton mantles and glittering jewels a stark contrast to the grim purpose that etched their faces. Their privilege was not an exemption from the cosmic balance. It was a deeper responsibility, a debt that required payment in personal suffering. Before each of them, an attendant priest held a small woven basket containing the sacred instruments of their devotion. Sharpened bonal spines from the maguey plant honed to a needle's point, and cords of rough hemp to draw the precious blood into waiting bowls. There was no drumbeat to mask the sounds of this ceremony, only the heavy, expectant silence, and the low, rhythmic chanting of a single elder priest who invoked the gods to witness this voluntary offering. The nobles' eyes were not raised to the sun, but turned inward, their focus on the act of will required to pierce their own flesh. A high lord, his face a mask of serene determination, was the first to step forward. He selected a long, sharpened bone needle from the basket. Without a flicker of hesitation, he pulled the tip of his own tongue taut between his fingers. His eyes watered with the involuntary reflex, but his hand was steady. With a swift, sure motion, he drove the needle through the muscle. A collective, sharp inhalation hissed through the gathered nobles. Blood, dark and immediate, welled from the puncture, filling his mouth with its copper taste. He did not spit it out. He let it flow, opening his mouth slightly to allow the crimson stream to drip into the small jade bowl held beneath his chin. Each drop was a spoken prayer, a direct offering of his life's water to the insatiable deities. Next, a noble woman of advanced years, her hair streaked with silver, took a maguey spine. Her hands, usually occupied with weaving or directing servants, did not tremble as she raised the thorn to the delicate lobe of her own ear. She pressed the point deep into the flesh, her breath catching only slightly as a bright bead of blood swelled and traced a hot path down her neck. She caught it on a strip of sacred bark paper, which quickly darkened and grew heavy with the offering. The pain was a currency, and she paid it willingly. Her eyes closed in a trance of devotion, her personal discomfort a paltry price for the continued favor of the gods. One by one, the nobles performed their rites. The soft, wet sounds of punctured flesh were the only punctuation in the solemn silence. Some drew the blood-soaked cords through their wounds, wringing them out into ceremonial vessels. Others used the sharp implements to score their calves or thighs, adding the blood from their limbs to the collective offering. The bowls and papers began to fill, a growing testament to the piety of the ruling class. This was not the grand, theatrical offering of a warrior's heart, but a quieter, more personal covenant. Their blood, the same that flowed in the veins of emperors and generals, was just as potent, just as necessary. They proved their worth not by sending others to die, but by willingly shedding their own. Drop by painful drop in the silent, sacred space of their own privilege, ensuring the gods knew that even the highest among men were willing to bleed for the world. The young man who was no longer a man moved through the city like a living god, and the city loved him for it. For one full cycle of the calendar, he had been the center of a beautiful, heartbreaking fiction, chosen for his flawless beauty, his grace, and a voice that could soothe the most troubled spirit. He had been plucked from his life and transformed into the earthly vessel of Tenochtitlan, the smoke-and mirror, the god of night and destiny. He was the Cuauhtli, the god's impersonator, and his reign of absolute reverence was as glorious as it was finite. The festival of Tenochtitlan was his zenith and his end, a year-long crescendo of adoration culminating in the inevitable sacred silence of the knife. He was lavished with every pleasure the empire could provide. He dwelt not in a cell, but in a fine house, attended by a retinue of priests, who treated his every whim as a divine command. He ate from golden plates, food fit for the gods themselves, steaming tamales stuffed with tender game, frothy chocolate spiced with vanilla, ripe tropical fruits that burst with sweetness. He was dressed in exquisite robes, woven with iridescent feathers, and adorned with polished jade and gold. For beautiful maidens, themselves chosen for their purity and grace, were given to him as companions, taught to treat him with the devotion owed to a deity. He learned to play the flute, its haunting melodies said to be the very voice of Tenochtitlan, and he would walk the streets of Tenochtitlan playing it, scattering blessings with every note. The people fell to their knees as he passed, not in fear but in awe, reaching out to touch the hem of his garment, believing his touch could confer fortune. He was the most cherished man in the world, his life a continuous performance of divine favor. He attended feasts and ceremonies, his presence a blessing upon them. He was consulted on matters of import, his words, though his own, taken as oracles. The fiction was perfect, immersive, and utterly seductive. For a year, he was not immortal. He was the embodiment of capricious, powerful divinity, showered with a love so intense it felt like truth. But the calendar turned, and the final month of his divinity arrived. The adoration took on a new, sharper edge, a bittersweet quality. The feasts in his honor were also farewells. The looks of reverence now held a glimmer of pity, a silent acknowledgment of the glorious sacrifice to come. The beautiful illusion was beginning to fray at the edges, revealing the stark, immutable truth beneath. All this love was but a prelude to the ultimate offering. The god had been honored. Now, the man who had played him must make his final walk. The music stopped. Not with a fading echo, but with a sharp, deliberate crack that severed the final note from the air. The beautiful, haunting melody he had played for a year, the sound that had announced his divine presence in every street and plaza, was silenced by his own hand. The young man who had been Tezcatlipoca stood at the edge of the sacred precinct, the fragments of his finely crafted flute scattered at his feet like broken bones. The act was not one of anger or despair, but of ritual severance. The music had been the voice of the god. Its destruction was the first, irrevocable step in shedding that divine skin, in preparing the vessel for its emptying. A profound silence descended, heavier and more absolute than any he had known during his year of reign. The crowd, which had moments before been a living tapestry of adoration, now watched in breathless stillness. The fiction was over. The beautiful lie had been broken along with the flutes. The man who remained was no longer the smoking mirror. He was simply the offering, stripped of his divine attributes, standing naked in the truth of his fate. The four maidens who had been his companions turned away, their role complete, their tears not for the god but for the man they had come to know, now lost to the relentless machinery of faith. He did not look at them, nor at the fragments of his past life. His gaze was fixed ahead, on the immense staircase of the temple pyramid. The steps, which he had descended so many times to walk among his worshippers, now rose before him like a gateway to another world. The priests in their dark robes formed two silent lines, creating a path for him, their faces impassive masks of duty. There was no fanfare now, no cheering throngs, no showers of flowers. The adoration had been a prelude. This was the sacrament. He took his first step onto the bottom stair. The stone was cold and familiar beneath his bare feet. Then he took another and another, beginning the long, silent ascent. The only sound was the whisper of his own breath and the soft scuff of his feet on the weathered stone. The crowd below remained motionless, a sea of upturned faces rendered mute by the gravity of the moment. They were witnessing the final unraveling of the god they had loved, the quiet, terrible transition from cherished deity to consecrated victim. Each step upward was a step further away from the world of music and feasts and beautiful maidens, a step deeper into the silent, focused intent of the ritual. He climbed without hesitation, his body moving with a grace that was entirely his own, now that the god had been stripped away. The silence was his new garment, and he wore it with a calm that spoke of an acceptance so deep it had become a kind of peace. The walk had begun. The only thing left was to meet the sky. His calm was not the stillness of resignation, but the profound quiet of a river reaching the sea, its journey complete, its purpose fulfilled. As he ascended the final stretch of the pyramid, the silence around him thickened, becoming a tangible thing, a sacred space carved from the very air. The priests who flanked the steps did not move to guide or hurry him. Their presence was merely a frame for his solitary act of will. His face, which for a year had been a mask of divine caprice, was now utterly serene, stripped of performance and fear alike. He had absorbed every moment of his year of glory, the adoration, the music, the taste of exquisite foods. The touch of reverent hands, and it had filled him with a gratitude so vast there was no room for anything else. The onlookers below, their hearts pounding in their throats, could not look away. They saw not a victim being led to slaughter, but a soul achieving a terrifying and beautiful clarity. His acceptance was more powerful than any cry of defiance could have been. It was a mirror held up to their own faith, reflecting it back not as a set of rituals, but as a lived, breathing truth. In his peaceful ascent, they saw the validation of their entire world. The gods were real, the sacrifice was holy, and the chosen ones did not go unwillingly into the dark, but walked toward it with open eyes and a tranquil heart. His calm was a gift to them, a final blessing that soothed their own secret fears about the price of existence. At the summit, High Priest Itzli waited, the obsidian blade already in his hand, its edge catching the last of the day's light. The other priests on the platform parted, creating a path to the altar stone. The young man's eyes met Itzli's, and in that glance, something immense and wordless passed between them, an understanding that transcended the roles of priest and victim, a recognition of the terrible, beautiful symmetry of the moment. It was not a look of plea or command, but of shared purpose. The young man's lips moved, forming words too soft for anyone but Itzli and the gods to hear. They were not a prayer for mercy, but a final personal offering of thanks for the year of life lived as a god, and an affirmation of his readiness to complete the exchange. Then he lay himself upon the cold, convex stone, his body fitting the familiar contours with the ease of one coming home. He did not need to be held down. His arms rested at his sides, his gaze fixed on the endless blue above. His utter lack of resistance, his total and willing surrender, was the most powerful part of the ritual. It transformed the act from one of taking to one of receiving. Itzli's hand, usually so steady, trembled for a fraction of a second, moved by the absolute purity of the offering before him. The silence on the summit was absolute, a held breath waiting for the release. The blade fell. It was swift, precise, and merciful. There was no struggle, only a final soft exhalation that seemed to merge with the sigh of the wind. As Itzli raised the heart, still and magnificent, toward the heavens, a wave of something more complex than relief washed over the priests and the few privileged witnesses on the summit. It was a feeling of awe, humbled by the victim's grace. His calm acceptance had not just fulfilled the ritual, it elevated it, leaving an imprint on their souls far deeper than the blood on the altar. They would carry the memory of his peaceful face and his final silent thanks into all their future ceremonies, a lasting testament that the greatest strength was not in fighting fate, but in embracing it with a heart full of grace. The god was gone. The man was gone. But the echo of his final walk would linger in the stones of the temple and in the hearts of all who saw it forever. The air in the small lamplit cell was still and close, smelling of dried herbs, cold stone, and the faint, sweet scent of the sacred ointments that had been used to anoint the chosen one. The young captive, a warrior from the eastern hills named Mazatal, sat on a reed mat, his wrists bound with soft cords that were a symbol of his status, not a restraint. Had been purified, fed the finest foods, and treated with a reverence that felt more disquieting than any dungeon. His fate was no longer a secret. The solemn faces of the priests, the hushed tones, the view of the towering temple from his small window, all spoke of the honor and the horror that awaited him at dawn. The priest who entered was not the fearsome high priest Itzli, but an elder named Quetzal, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes holding a deep, unsettling calm. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, lowering himself to sit opposite Mazatal. He did not carry the tools of sacrifice, but a small, intricately painted codex, which he unrolled on the floor between them. The flickering lamplight illuminated the vibrant images, a radiant sun, a lush paradise of flowing water and abundant fruit trees, figures of warriors feasting and laughing. Quetzal's voice, when he spoke, was a low, soothing murmur, like water over smooth stones. He did not speak of the cut of the blade or the spill of blood. Instead, his words painted a picture of a journey, a glorious transition. He explained that Mazatal's life was not being taken, but being exchanged, his mortal strength traded for an immortal reward. He described the House of the Sun, the magnificent realm reserved for warriors who fell in battle or were chosen for the supreme honor of the sacrifice. There, he said, the sun god Huitzilopochtli himself would welcome Mazatal as a brother. A fellow warrior who had provided the strength for the sun's daily battle against the darkness. The priest's finger traced the images on the codex. He spoke of it, existence free from want, where the fields were eternally ripe with maize and the trees bent low with exotic fruits. He described a life of endless honor, where Mazatl would join the celestial army, following the sun on his daily journey across the sky, singing songs of victory and feasting in the golden halls each evening. His death here, in this world of toil and pain, was merely the doorway to a greater, more radiant life. His body was a vessel that would be joyfully emptied, so that his spirit could soar to its true home, to a place of light and glory that the living could only dream of. Mazatl listened, his initial tension slowly ebbing away under the tide of the priest's hypnotic words. The fear of the knife, the terror of the unknown, began to be overshadowed by the vision of the paradise being offered. It was a brilliant, compassionate seduction, a trading of earthly terror for celestial hope. The priest's assurance was absolute, his faith unshakable. He spoke not as a man delivering a condemned prisoner to his death, but as a guide preparing a valued traveler for a magnificent voyage. He promised that his sacrifice would be remembered in songs, that his name would be spoken with reverence, and that his spirit would watch over his people, a benevolent star in the sky of his ancestors. By the time Cuauhtli finished, rolling the codex with a final soft sigh, the cell no longer felt like a waiting room for death. It felt like an antechamber to heaven. The dread in Mazatl's heart had been transmuted into a tremulous, awe-filled anticipation. The priest's words had built a bridge over the abyss of his fear, a bridge paved with promises of glory and eternal peace. He saw not the cold altar stone awaiting him, but the golden gates of the sun god's domain swinging open. His death was no longer an end. It was a promotion, a graduation from the fleeting world of men to the everlasting realm of the gods. The promise had been made, and in the quiet of the lamplit cell, Mazatl chose to believe it, wrapping himself in the glorious fiction as his final, comforting garment. The sun, that day, did not merely weaken, it died in the sky. It began as a subtle nibble at the edge of the brilliant disk, a dark, creeping curvature that the calendar priests had foretold, but the people had dreaded. A strange cold twilight descended. Hours before its time, the light leaching from the world not with the gentle gradient of evening, but with a swift, sickening steel. The vibrant blues of the lake and sky turned a muted gray, the white of the temple walls to a deathly pallor. Birds fell silent mid-song, and a profound, unnatural hush smothered the bustling city of Tenochtitlan. This was not the sun's hunger. This was its consumption. The moon, the sun's dark brother, was devouring it whole. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the heart of the city. The calculated reverence of the sacrifice, the orderly terror of the new fire ceremony, these were rituals with a known path and a promised end. This was different. This was the universe unraveling before their eyes. A collective wail rose from the throats of thousands, a sound of pure, undiluted terror. People poured from their homes, their faces upturned to the horrifying spectacle, their hands clawing at the air as if they could pull the light back down. Children screamed and buried their faces in their mothers' skirts. The world was being unmade, and the promised eternal night, the domain of the skeletal star demons known as the Titsimum, was descending to claim them. From the summit of the Templo Mayor High Priest, Itzli's voice cracked like thunder, cutting through the bedlam. He did not sound like an old man. He sounded like the wrath of the gods themselves. His commands were screamed, not chanted, to the priests below. This was no time for a single perfect offering. The sun was being murdered in the heavens, and only a flood of the most potent life force could possibly revive it. The demand was not for quality, but for overwhelming quantity. The gates of the sacred precinct were thrown open, and the jaguar and eagle warriors, their own faces, masks of controlled fear, moved into the crowd with a new, terrible purpose. They did not seek only warriors or the flawless. They seized strong men from their families, women known for their vitality, even the elderly, who had lived long. Full Livzini vessel that held a spark of the tonali that the dying sun desperately needed. The processions to the temple were not solemn. They were chaotic, a river of terrified humanity being dragged toward the blood-darkened stones. The priests, their eyes wild with a fervor born of absolute dread, worked in a frenzy. The elegant, precise art of the heart extraction became a brutal, efficient harvesting. One after another, Victims were laid upon the altar, the obsidian blade rising and falling in a relentless, bloody rhythm. The air grew thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smoke of hastily kindled copa, a desperate incense to accompany the slaughter. The darkness deepened, the sun reduced to a thin, brilliant ring of fire around the perfect black circle of the moon, a terrifying celestial eye, staring down at the carnage below. The sacrifices continued, a desperate tithe paid to a vanishing god. The priests chanted until their voices were raw, their arms grew tired, and the blood ran in rivulets down the temple steps, forming a dark, glistening pool at its base. They were not offering lives, they were throwing them at the darkness, a desperate barrage of spirit fuel to reignite the celestial furnace. The world held its breath, teetering on the edge of oblivion, its fate hanging on the hope that the gods would find this sudden, massive offering enough to sat the abyss and release their stolen son. The air over the calm, dark waters of the sacred Senat was heavy, not with the promise of rain, but with the certainty of a different kind of offering. This was not the domain of the sun god, with his demands for blazing hearts and public spectacle. This was the realm of Tlaloc, the god of rain, fertility, and the life-giving waters that could, in his caprice, also bring flood and ruin. His altars were not stone blocks under an open sky, but the deep, still surfaces of natural wells, gateways to his watery underworld. And his preferred sacrifice was not a swift, fiery end, but a slow, deliberate surrender to the depths. The victims chosen for Tlaloc were different. They were not warriors captured in glorious battle, but often children, or those whose physical traits, a certain birthmark, a particular way their hair grew, were deemed especially pleasing to the capricious water god. Their purity was their potency. They were brought to the edge of the cenote, a gaping mouth in the earth, whose still black water reflected the anxious faces of the attending priests and the somber gray of the sky. The children, too young to fully grasp their fate, were often dressed in fine blue garments and given small, elaborate toys to hold precious objects that would sink with them, gifts to appease the god's watery court. The priests of Tlaloc, their faces hidden behind goggle-eyed masks of turquoise and shell, began a low, ululating chant, a sound that seemed to ripple the water's surface without any physical touch. The rhythm was not the driving beat of the war drum, but the pulsing, liquid cadence of falling rain and flowing rivers. They anointed the victims with water from the cenote itself, a chilling baptism that made them gasp and shiver. The cold was a precursor, a taste of the element that would claim them. Then came the moment of offering. The priests did not wield blades. Their tools were their hands and the weight of sacred duty. They lifted the first child, a small boy clutching a beautifully carved wooden jaguar. His eyes were wide, not yet with terror, but with confusion at the solemn faces and the strange rhythmic sounds. As they held him over the dark water, the first tears welled in his eyes, sparked by the cold anointing and the unsettling gravity of the adults around him. Fervent murmur passed through the priests. The tears were the first and most potent offering, a sacred sympathy with the element they sought to invoke. The child's crying was not a distress to be soothed, but a prayer to be encouraged. They lowered him into the water. The shock of the cold was immediate, a sharp intake of breath that was his last taste of air. The struggle began then, not a violent thrashing, but a desperate, instinctual fight for a surface that the priests ensured he could not reach. They held him under, their grips firm, yet ritualistic, their chants rising to a crescendo that drowned out the frantic bubbling sounds from below. His small hands opened, releasing the wooden toy, which spiraled down into the blackness ahead of him. His struggles were seen as a vital part of the ritual. Each gasp for air that found only water, each frantic movement of his limbs, was a potent emission of his life force, his tenali, directly into Tlal's realm. It was a drowning not just of a body but of a spirit, its essence dissolving into the water to be carried through underground rivers to nourish the roots of the world and coax the rains from the stubborn sky. One by one, the other victims followed, their individual struggles adding to the sacred charge being poured into the Senat. The water, once still and reflective, was now agitated, its dark surface churned by the final sacred acts of the offerings. When the last stilled form sank into the depths, the priests fell silent. The only sound was the drip of water from their arms in the quiet, collective exhalation of completed duty. They gathered the remaining ritual objects and withdrew, leaving the cenote to its dark, silent keeping. The surface of the water slowly stilled once more, becoming a perfect black mirror that held the secrets of the sacrifices within its depths. The drowning was complete. Potent offerings of tears and struggle had been given. All that remained was to wait and see if the god of rain, in his watery palace, would find the payment sufficient and open the skies. The air above the ceremonial plaza shimmered with a different kind of heat, a dry, crackling intensity that carried the scent of pine resin and scorched stone. This was not the focused sacred smoke of the temple summit, but the raw, consuming breath of open flame. At the center of the cleared space, a great pyre had been built, a mountain of tightly stacked logs and kindling that reached higher than a man's head. The flames once lit did not dance and flicker with a contained reverence. They roared, a living, hungry beast of orange and gold, its voice a constant, deafening roar that swallowed all other sound. The fire ritual was not an offering of a single, pure heart, but a brutal purification by inferno, a test of endurance for the gods themselves. The captives, a dozen strong-limbed warriors taken in the last flower war, were brought forward. Their bodies, already marked with the bruises of battle and capture, gleamed with a sheen of ritual oil that smelled of sharp, astringent herbs. They were not bound, but their resolve was held fast by the grim-faced jaguar warriors who flanked them. Their Cuauhtli a silent promise of a quicker, less honorable end should they try to flee. The captive's eyes, wide and reflecting the leaping flames, held a terror far more primal than that of the altar. The swift kiss of the obsidian blade was a known, almost clinical end. This was a descent into the elemental maw of pain itself. One by one, they were seized and hurled into the heart of the conflagration. There was no ceremony, no chant, only the brutal, efficient motion of the priests and warriors as they launched the living offerings into the flames. The fire welcomed them with a voracious embrace. The oil on their skin ignited instantly, transforming them into shrieking, stumbling torches. The air filled with a sound worse than the fire's roar, the raw animal screams of beings being cooked alive, a horrifying chorus of agony that tore at the edges of the watching crowd's fervor. The scent of burning hair and searing flesh cut through the smell of pine, a sickening perfume of sacrifice. But death was not the immediate goal. The ritual demanded not their consumed bodies, but their pain-sanctified lives. As the victims writhed within the inferno, their skin blistering and blackening, teams of priests armed with long assault poles waited as close to the heat as they could bear. Their eyes squinted against the blinding glare, tracked the movements of the figures within the flames. Timing was everything. They waited for the moment when the victims' screams reached a piercing zenith, when the life force within was at its most potent, seared and concentrated by the agony. Then, with a coordinated heave, they hooked a limb or the torso and dragged the burning, shrieking form back out of the pyre and onto the scorched earth. The figures that emerged were horrors of charred meat and raw weeping flesh. Their bodies contorted in final rigid poses of agony, were still alive, their hearts hammering against ruined ribs, their minds surely shattered by the pain. The fire priests descended upon them immediately, not with water or solace, but with the same obsidian blades used on the sun altar. The charred chest was a grim tableau, but the priests worked with a brutal efficiency, cutting through the burned tissue to reach the prize within. The heart, when torn free, was offered not to the sky, but to the raging fire itself, cast back into the flames as the ultimate pain-forged sustenance for the god of this savage rite. The body, its purpose served, was left to smolder on the stones, a stark, brutal testament to the belief that some gods demanded not just life, but exquisite suffering as their sacred due. The city awoke to a rhythm that was not the familiar beat of the sun drum, but something older, more visceral, a deep, pulsing throb of turtle-shelled drums and the dry, rustling whisper of moving seed pods. The air, still cool from the retreating night, carried the faint, sweetly rancid odor of cured leather and sacred herbs. It was the final day of Tlaquepaquesli, and the time had come for the ultimate act of renewal. The priests of Xipe emerged from the temple precinct, and the people of Tenochtitlan, lining the streets and crowding the rooftops, fell into a hushed, reverent silence, their faces a mixture of awe and primal unease. They were no longer men, but visions of the god himself. Their bodies, once concealed by robes, were now encased in the flayed skins of the sacrifices offered at the dawn of the festival. The skins, tanned and treated with oils, clung to their forms like a second ill-fitting hide, the color of old parchment gone yellow. The empty sacks of the victims' faces hung slack over their own, the hollow eye sockets and stitched-shut mouths creating a mask of terrifying anonymity. Their hands were sheathed in the leathery gloves of the dead, fingers stiff and unnatural. With every movement, the skins emitted a soft scraping sound, a whisper of the lives that had been shed to make this sacred garment. They were walking symbols of the cycle's brutal truth. New life could only emerge from the death and casting off of the old. They began to dance. It was not a dance of joy or celebration, but a slow, shuffling, hypnotic movement, a pantomime of the earth's awakening. Their steps were heavy, grounded, imitating the push of a sprout through the soil. They shook rattles made of human bones and seed pods, the sound a mimicry of spring rain falling on dry ground. Their arms rose and fell in slow, deliberate motions, like maize stalks growing toward the sun. The rhythm of the drums was the heartbeat of the earth itself, and the skin dancers were its moving, breathing agents, a grotesque appearance a necessary reminder of the price of the green world returning. They moved through the city's main thoroughfares in a snaking, silent procession, a river of death giving birth to life. The people did not cheer or cry out. They reached out with trembling hands, not to touch the dancers, but to brush the air around them, hoping to capture a fragment of the potent, transformative magic they carried. Farmers, their faces etched with hope and worry, bowed their heads as they passed, praying that the sacred energy of the danced skins would bless their fields and ensure a bountiful harvest. The dancers were a living, moving prayer, their every step a plea and a promise, their macabre costumes, a testament to the belief that from rot comes growth, from death comes life, and from the flayed skin of a man comes the renewal of the entire world. The obsidian blade felt different in its Lee's hand. It was the same tecpadal he had used for decades, its edge still honed to a lethal perfection by the master napper, its weight and balance as familiar as his own heartbeat. Yet, as he stood in his private chamber after the day's third sacrifice, the cool, glassy surface against his palm seemed to hold not a sliver of divine power, but a profound and chilling silence. The blood of the offering had been washed from his hands and arms, the chants had faded from the air, but a residue of the act clung to him, a psychic stain that no amount of water or incense could purge. That night, sleep did not come as a respite, but as an invasion. He dreamt not in images, but in sensations, a vast, dry thirst that parched the soul, a celestial emptiness that stretched into forever. He was floating in the black space between stars, and before him hung the sun, but it was not the god Huitzilopochtli. It was a gaping, bloodless mouth, a wound in the fabric of the sky, and from the temple far below, a tiny, endless stream of red droplets spiraled upward, each one a life, a heart, a scream swallowed by the infinite maw. The stream was constant, a river of sacrifice stretching back through centuries. Yet the mouth remained open, eternally hungry, eternally unsatisfied. The more it drank, the wider it yawned, a paradox of need that defied all logic. A voice that was not a voice echoed in the void, a thought that was his and not his. Asterisk, when will it be enough? Lee awoke with a gasp, his heart hammering against his aged ribs, his cotton sleeping mat soaked with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the night's warmth. The dream's terrible clarity did not fade with waking. It lodged itself in his mind, a splinter of ice in the core of his faith. He rose and walked to the narrow window of his cell, looking out at the sleeping city, its outlines softened by moonlight. The great pyramids were dark silhouettes against the starry sky, monuments to the countless lives that had been given upon them. He saw the faces then not as a faceless procession of offerings, but as individuals. Cuauhtli the Eagle Knight, with his serene acceptance, the Tezcatlipoca impersonator, with his final, peaceful thanks, the Tlaxcalan captive Malinali, with his defiant pride. The children offered to Tlaloc, their tears glistening, the burned and broken forms from the fire ritual, a river of faces, a nation of the dead, all fed into the insatiable mouth of his dream. The calculus of his life's work, once so clear and righteous, now seemed like a madness. He had believed he was a gardener tending the cosmic balance, but the dream asked a horrifying question. What if he was merely a keeper, feeding a beast that could never be sated? What if the hunger was not the sun's, but their own, a reflection of a deep, unacknowledged fear that could only be quieted by an ever-increasing torrent of blood? The doubt uncoiled within him, cold and serpentine. It did not shout. It whispered, its voice terribly reasonable. It pointed to the droughts that still came, despite the drownings, the eclipses that demanded panic and massacre. The endless demands from gods who gave life, but seemed to require an ocean of death to maintain it. The unwavering certainty that had been the foundation of his existence for over 60 years developed a hairline crack. And in the silent pre-dawn darkness, High Priest Itzli, the most devout man in Tenochtitlan, stood at his window and wondered if the gods were truly nourished by the blood, or if they were simply thirsty. The weight of the dream did not lift with the dawn. It settled deeper, a cold stone in the pit of Itzli's stomach that the rising sun could not warm. The familiar rituals of the morning felt hollow, performed by rote, his hands moving through the cleansing, and the prayers, while his mind remained trapped in the vast, hungry void of his nightmare. The faces of the junior priests, bright with unquestioning fervor, seemed suddenly childish to him, their faith a beautiful, fragile shell that his new doubt could shatter with a single word. He knew he could not give voice to the heresy festering within him, not to them. There was only one person in the city whose wisdom was ancient enough, whose devotion was deep enough, to perhaps hold the weight of his terrifying question. He found the elder priest Axolotl in the quietest corner of the temple gardens, a place where the high walls muffled the city's noise and the air was sweet with the scent of night-blooming flowers that still clung to the day. Axolotl was so old he seemed to be made of the same leather and bone as the sacred texts he studied. His eyes, milky with cataracts, were turned toward the sun, not in supplication, but in a quiet, knowing absorption of its warmth. He did not turn as Itzli approached, but his dry, whispery voice cut through the silence. The sun feels weak today, on my face. Itzli, it feels hungry. The words, so eerily close to his own thoughts, sent a chill through Itzli. He sank onto the stone bench beside the ancient man, the words he had practiced crumbling to ash in his mouth. For a long moment he could only sit in the shared silence, the weight of his doubt, a physical pressure. Finally, haltingly, he began to speak. He did not mention the dream's visceral horror, but he gave voice to the question it had spawned. He spoke of the river of blood that never seemed to fill the celestial need, of the faces of the sacrifice that now haunted him, not as honored heroes, but as a countless silent multitude. He confessed the chilling thought that the gods' hunger might be a bottomless abyss, and their devotion a futile attempt to fill it. Axolotl listened without interruption, his blind eyes still fixed on the sun. When Itzli fell silent, spent and trembling with the sacrilege he had uttered, the old man let the silence stretch, thick and heavy. A fat bee buzzed lazily between the flowers. "You feel the weight of the gift," Axolotl said at last, his voice not one of condemnation, but of deep, weary understanding. "This is the burden of the priest, not the warrior. The warrior offers his own life once. We offer the lives of others, again and again and again. It is a heavier thing." He turned his sightless gaze toward Itzli, and it felt more piercing than any stare. "You ask if it is enough. That is the wrong question, my son. The question is not about sufficiency, but about necessity. The world is not built on fairness, but on balance. The sun gives life. For this gift, it requires life in return. This is the first and oldest law, written in the stars and the seasons." He gestured with a gnarled hand toward the garden around them. See the maze. "The seed must die in the dark earth to give life to the stalk. The stalk is cut down at harvest so that the people may live. We are all part of this exchange. Our sacrifices are the seeds we plant in the dark soil of the divine. We do not do it because we know it will be enough. We do it because we must. To doubt the necessity is to doubt the foundation of the world itself. It is to invite the Tizai Simum down from the stars, to dance on the bones of everything we have built. The old man's words were not a comfort. They were a reaffirmation of the terrible burden. They offered no answer to the dream's infinite hunger, only a stark ultimatum. Continue the cycle, or be responsible for its end. The doubt was not erased, but it was corralled, placed back within the context of duty. Itzli's choice was not between right and wrong, but between faith and annihilation. He left the garden not with a lightened heart, but with a reinforced resolve. The cold stone of doubt still in his belly, now encased in the harder stone of necessity. The gods might be eternally thirsty, but it remained his duty to bring them water, lest the world die of drought. The doubt was a luxury the world could not afford. The sun was a merciless tyrant, a white-hot coin nailed to a bleached and empty sky. Day after day, it rose with the same brutal indifference, scorching the world below with a gaze that held no pity, only a parched and endless hunger. The Great Lake surrounding Tenochtitlan, once a shimmering expanse of life and trade, began to shrink. Its shores receding to reveal cracked gray mudflats littered with the skeletons of stranded fish and water plants. The canals that wove through the city like liquid streets grew shallow and thick, their waters tepid and foul-smelling. The air itself was a kill, heavy with dust and the desperate scent of thirst. In the fields, the maize stalks, once proud and green, stood withered and brown, their leaves curled into brittle fists. The beans and squash plants shriveled in the earth, offering nothing but dust. The floating chinampas, those miraculous gardens that fed the city, became rafts of dying vegetation, their fertile soil turning to powder. A silence fell over the countryside, broken only by the dry rattle of dead leaves in the hot wind, and the low, anxious murmuring of the farmers who watched their world and their future turn to dust in their hands. Desperation, cold and sharp, began to seep through the cracks in the city's stoic facade. The carefully maintained rituals, the measured pace of sacrifice that had sustained the balance for generations, now seemed like a child offering a thimble of water to a forest fire. The people looked to the priests with eyes that were no longer filled with reverent awe, but with a raw, questioning need. The hunger in their bellies mirrored the hunger in the sky, and they demanded an answer, a payment large enough to quench the divine thirst that was killing them. The temples became factories of fervor, the rhythm of the drums now a frantic, panicked heartbeat. The processions of captives to the summit of the Templo Mayor were no longer solemn affairs. They were desperate torrents, a ceaseless river of life being poured onto the stones in the hope that enough blood would finally satiate the sun. The air around the Great Pyramid grew permanently thick with the smell of death and incense, a metallic fog that clung to the back of the throat. The priests worked until their arms ached and their voices were raw, their chants becoming pleas shouted into the unforgiving heavens. The Tenochtitlan swelled, its grim latticework filling with skulls, until it seemed the very structure would groan under the weight of so much futile offering. Yet the sun remained a hateful white eye in a barren sky, and the dust continued to blow through the streets of a city dying of thirst, its people learning the terrible truth that some hungers might be too vast for any amount of blood to ever fill. The air in Tenochtitlan tasted of dust, desperation, and a metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat, the scent of a city slowly bleeding itself dry under a relentless sun. For Toel, a scribe of the Kh people, captured in a skirmish on the empire's southern fringe, the great capital was not a jewel of civilization, but a beautiful, terrifying nightmare. His value lay not in his strength for sacrifice or labor, but in his literacy. The Aztec priests, in their strange, pragmatic way, had spared him for his ability to record, to observe. They wanted an account of their glory, their piety, their power. Did not know that the chronicle he was secretly keeping, etched with a sharpened bone into deerskin he hid beneath his sleeping mat, was not one of admiration, but of a soul-deep horror, meticulously documented. From his assigned cell near the temple precinct, he had a grim ringside seat to the empire's frantic death spiral. He witnessed the endless processions of captives, not just warriors, but farmers, artisans, even the old and infirm being dragged toward the blood-slick stairs of the Templo Mayor. The one-sorterly chants of the priests had devolved into ragged, screamed invocations their voices hoarse with a panic they could no longer conceal. The sacred rhythms were gone, replaced by the ceaseless, sickening thud of bodies falling down the pyramid steps, a macabre percussion to the city's unraveling. Toll's hand trembled as he recorded it. He drew the scenes not with the elegant glyphs of his own people, but with swift, stark lines that captured the raw terror, the vacant eyes of a child chosen for Tlaloc, the defiant grimace of a Tlaxcalan warrior meeting the priest's blade, the frantic, jerking dance of a man being pulled from the ritual fire. He noted the dwindling supplies in the market, the hollow look in the eyes of the common people, the way the priests. Assurances now sounded less like divine certainty and more like a mantra spoken to ward off a coming storm. He was fascinated by the intricate theology of it all, the complex calendar, the precise symbolism, the absolute, unshakable belief that this was the only way to sustain creation. It was a breathtaking, sophisticated madness. But his fascination was forever curdled by a cold, gripping terror. This was not the way of his people. His gods demanded respect, offerings of maize and incense, sometimes the blood of a turkey or a deer. They did not demand this industrial consumption of human spirit. He saw the gleaming white temples not as houses of the divine, but as abattoirs on a cosmic scale. The reverence of the crowds felt like a collective delirium, a sickness of the soul that had infected an entire civilization. He recorded the scale of it, the terrifying efficiency, the sheer number of lives fed into the stone mouths of the gods, and he felt a profound, isolating fear. He was a captive not just of the Aztec Empire, but of a reality where the sun required a river of blood to rise, and he wondered, his stylus pausing over the hide, if such a god, if such a world was worthy of being saved at all. His chronicle was a testament to a piety so absolute it had become a form of insanity, and he prayed to his own quieter gods that its shadow would never fall upon the green hills of his homeland. A new whisper slithered through the dusty, desperate streets of Tenochtitlan, a rumor carried on the hot, stagnant wind that blew from the eastern coast. It did not speak of failing crops or the sun's relentless hunger, but of something far more tangible and far more terrifying. It spoke of pale strangers. Men not of this world, it was said, with skin the color of bleached bone, and hair like dried maize silk, who had arrived on great wooden houses that walked on the water without sails or paddles. They rode upon impossible giant deer with hooves of thunder, and they wielded sticks that spoke with the voice of lightning and smoke, felling men from a distance with a sound like the sky cracking open. The whispers were at first dismissed as the ravings of sun-addled traders or the fearful fantasies of a people pushed to the brink. But the stories persisted, growing in detail and certainty with each telling. They spoke of these strangers not as men, but as Teddio, gods perhaps, or demons, who displayed a power that defied all understanding. They were said to be insatiable not for blood like the Aztec gods, but for a different kind of sustenance, yellow metal that gleamed like captured sunlight and strange green stones that held the depth of the forest within them. The rumors cast a long, cold shadow over the rituals that continued with frantic, desperate energy on the temple summits. As High Priest Itzli raised the obsidian blade, his invocations to Huitzilopochtli now felt thin, his words seeming to bounce back from a sky that had grown deaf, or worse, indifferent. The people who gathered to watch the sacrifices did so with a new distraction in their eyes. Their gazes would often flicker toward the eastern causeways, as if expecting to see these pale specters marching out of the heat haze at any moment. The ceaseless flow of blood, which had once been the absolute center of their cosmic understanding, now felt like a peripheral concern. A desperate habit continued in the face of a looming, unknown threat. The certainty that had underpinned their world, the belief that the universe operated on a precise, bloody equation that they alone understood, began to erode. If there were other powers in the world, beings with such unimaginable strength, then what of their gods? What of the endless sacrifices? Had it all been for nothing? The hunger of the sun was a known terror, a devil they had battled for centuries. The hunger of these pale strangers was an unknown, a void that threatened to swallow not just their lives, but the very meaning of them. The shadow of their arrival fell across the altars, making the blood there seem not like sacred sustenance, but like the futile scratching of ants on a stone soon to be overturned by a boot they could not comprehend. The empire, for all its power and piety, felt suddenly small, fragile, and terribly, terribly alone under the vast, uncaring sky. The obsidian felt cold in Itzli's hand, a dead weight that seemed to leach the warmth from his own aging bones. The air on the summit was thick, not with the usual sacred anticipation, but with a heavy, silent dread that clung to the stones and the lungs of the few priests in attendance. The sky above was a pale, washed-out blue, the sun a blurred and weary eye. Below, the city of Tenochtitlan was too quiet. Canals lay still and shallow. The bustling plazas were sparsely populated, and a strange, watchful tension had replaced the fervent energy that once thrummed through the streets. The rumors from the coast were a poison in the water, a silent tremor beneath the foundations of their world. The captive on the altar was a young man from some far-off village. His name irrelevant, his spirit already broken by the long march and the grim spectacles he had witnessed. He did not struggle as the priests positioned him, his eyes wide with a terror that was purely mortal, devoid of any glimmer of transcendent acceptance. He was just a man, afraid to die. Itzli looked down at him, and for the first time in his long devout life, he saw not a vessel of sacred tonality, not a note in a cosmic hymn, but simply a life about to be extinguished. The faces of all the others Cuauhtli, the Tezcatlipoca impersonator, the children, the burned, the drowned rose in his mind not as honored heroes, but as a silent, accusing army. His grip on the Tecpatel tightened, his knuckles white. The chants of the other priests sounded hollow, their words bouncing off a sky that felt empty, abandoned. Where was Huitzilopochtli's presence, that immense focused attention that had once vibrated in the air during a sacrifice? There was only silence, a vast, yawning indifference. Itzli's own faith, that unshakable mountain he had clung to even in the face of his own doubt, now felt like a sandcastle before a rising tide. The words of the invocation died on his lips. He could not speak the praises of a god who felt absent, who had perhaps never been listening at all. He performed the motions by memory alone, his body an automaton going through the steps of a play whose meaning had evaporated. The lift of the arm, the swift, precise arc of the blade, the wet, final sigh as it found its mark. His fingers delved into the warmth, found the frantic, beating heart, and tore it free. The act, once the pinnacle of his sacred duty, felt like butchery. As he raised the heart toward the sky, his arm trembled violently. The offering felt insignificant, a drop of water thrown at a desert. No divine presence surged to meet it. No roar of approval rose from the city below. There was only the hot, metallic smell of blood, the ragged breathing of the priests, and the overwhelming, crushing silence. He smeared the heart across the stone lips of the idol, the dark rock drinking the blood with its usual thirst. But the gesture felt empty. A habit continued out of fear, not devotion. The body was cast down the steps, its descent a dull, ugly series of thuds in the quiet air. Itzli stood there, the blood drying on his hands and arms, staring at the vacant sky. He had performed what he knew, in the deepest, most broken part of his soul, was the last sacrifice. Not because the world was saved, but because the world they had known was already gone. The gods had withdrawn, their hunger either sated or proven eternal and pointless. All that remained was the silence, the blood on the stones, and the uncertain, terrifying future marching toward them from the eastern sea. The ceremony was over. The balance was not restored, it was shattered. The silence was the first thing they noticed. It was not the peaceful quiet of a restful night or the hushed reverence of a temple vigil. This was a profound, deafening absence, a void where the familiar heartbeat of the city had once thrived. The great drum of Huitzilopochtli lay still, its skin cold and untouched. The conch shells remained silent. The rhythmic chanting that had woven through the air of Tenochtitlan for centuries, a constant reassuring murmur of devotion, had ceased. The temples, those towering engines of faith that had pulsed with life and death, stood as silent as tombs. The sacred fires in their braziers had been allowed to die out or had been extinguished, leaving behind only cold ash and the faint ghostly scent of old copal. The people emerged from their homes cautiously, their faces etched with a confusion that slowly curdled into a deep, unsettling dread. They looked toward the Templo Mayor, expecting to see the usual plume of smoke, to hear the familiar sounds of ceremony. They saw only stillness, They listened for the drums that should have announced the next ritual, the next procession, the next necessary payment to the gods. They heard only the wind sighing through the empty courtyards and the nervous whispers of their neighbors. The priests, usually so ubiquitous in their dark robes, were nowhere to be seen. The sacred precinct was deserted, its blood-darkened stones looking like a forgotten battlefield under the pale sun. A terrible question began to form in the minds of the people, a heresy so vast it was almost unthinkable. Had their offerings ever been enough? They had given everything, their bravest warriors, their most beautiful youths, their own blood drawn in silent, painful devotion. They had fed the gods a river of life, a mountain of hearts, a nation of souls. They had built an empire on the certainty of this brutal exchange, trusting that their suffering purchased the sun's rise, the rain's fall, the world's turning. Now, the machinery had ground to a halt. The gods were silent. The priests had withdrawn. The relentless hunger they had spent generations trying to sat had either been fulfilled, or it had been a bottomless abyss all along. The silence was worse than any plague, any drought, any eclipse. Those were terrors they knew how to fight, with rituals and sacrifices and desperate, fervent faith. This was different. This was the terror of being unheard, of prayers falling into an infinite void, of a covenant broken without explanation. The foundations of their reality, built stone by bloody stone over centuries, crumbled into dust. They stood in their dying city under a sun that felt increasingly like a stranger, and wondered if the gods had ever been listening at all. Or if they had simply been talking to the silence, bleeding for a sky that had always been empty.